Located approximately 400 kilometers west of the Russian mainland, around 1,300 kilometers from Moscow, Kaliningrad is bordered to the north and south by Lithuania and Poland. Essentially, it's a Russian outpost, but one that's had a growing strategic significance due to its close proximity to a large number of major European cities. Kaliningrad also has the only port on the Baltic Sea that remains ice-free all year, making it the ideal home for the Russian Navy's Baltic Fleet. Originally founded in the 13th century, this historic oblast is home to nearly 500,000 people, but also serves as a key strategical element in Russia's anti-NATO strategy. Recently, however, as Putin struggles to maintain Russia's status as a global superpower, Kaliningrad has become as much of a headache for him as it's been an asset and could become a serious liability to his campaign of aggressive expansion in Ukraine and beyond. For one, Russia's military forces remain overextended as the war in Ukraine drags on, leaving Kaliningrad largely out from under Putin's thumb, which may be why we're hearing a clear call for dissension rising up among its separatist groups. Emboldened by the hardships of the war, the leaders of the Baltic Republican Party have been calling not only for independence from Russia, but also for Kaliningrad to align with the West and its allies against the Russian president. Since the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, Moscow has enhanced both aerial and naval connections between the Russian mainland and Kaliningrad. Given Russia's current struggles in Ukraine, however, it seems unlikely that it will achieve its overall objective and isolate the Baltics. And as political pressures within Russia intensify and external pressures build due to the fallout of the war in Ukraine, the possibility of Russia losing Kaliningrad altogether has grown increasingly likely. If this happens, it will undoubtedly alter not only Russia's future, but also the futures of Europe, America, and various other parts of the world. So what's happening? How is Russia losing control of Kaliningrad? And perhaps a more important question, what consequences will there be if it does? In this video, we're going to take a look at these questions, while also closely examining the events that led up to this pivotal moment in Kaliningrad's long history. To really understand what the impact of losing Kaliningrad would be, we must first understand the influence it's had on Russia's recent history. Rewinding back to the first months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin found himself in desperate need of the Kaliningrad exclave. Rather quickly, what Putin thought would be a swift blitzkrieg all the way to Kyiv instead turned out to be something else entirely, as many of Russia's frontline troops ended up in hasty retreat from key regions such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy. This grievous miscalculation left Russia wide open to the possibility of a devastating counteroffensive. So Putin turned to one of the most powerful weapons in his arsenal, the threat of nuclear retaliation. And what has helped make this weapon an even more credible deterrent? That's right, Kaliningrad. To get the ball rolling as early as May 2022, as much of the Russian army fell into retreat, Putin initiated a series of provocative military exercises in Kaliningrad, with the intention of demonstrating that he could, hypothetically, launch nuclear warheads all across Europe. During the exercises, Russian troops practiced electronic launches of nuclear-capable Iskander mobile ballistic systems, the same systems being used against Ukraine. And for what ultimate purpose? Essentially, Putin wanted to make the point that as long as he controlled Kaliningrad, no NATO member state would be beyond his reach. What's interesting about these maneuvers, though, is that the primary goal of them may not have been to remind the West that Russia has nukes, but rather to remind them that Russia has Kaliningrad. It's hard to forget that Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, but it's much easier to forget, or at least to underestimate, the strategic importance of this relatively unassuming Baltic Sea exclave. This, however, would be a mistake. And for one very good reason, the Suwalki Gap, which is, according to many military analysts, by far NATO's weakest point. But more on that later. For now, it's important to note that Kaliningrad was not always a part of Russia. It was founded in 1255 by the Teutonic Knights under the name Königsberg, on the site of the ancient Old Prussian settlement of Twangstay. From then up until World War II, Königsberg would serve as Germany's easternmost major city. But after Germany's surrender in July and August of 1945, as part of the Potsdam Conference, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee, and US President Harry Truman effectively redrew Europe's borders, and in the end, Königsberg was handed over to the Soviet Union and renamed Kaliningrad in honor of Bolshevik revolutionary Mikhail Kalinin. Unsurprisingly, the region experienced a notable demographic shift as the German population was expelled and the Soviet citizens came flooding in. But as Europe has continued to evolve over the past 79 years, the Russian oblast has become increasingly isolated, and this isolation has only been exacerbated since the invasion of Ukraine. As neighboring countries close their borders, NATO expands its membership, and the Kremlin remains focused on waging war. So far, some 5,000 Kaliningrad residents have been mobilized to fight in Ukraine, with an estimated 450 being killed in action already. The authorities in Kaliningrad, however, rarely discuss casualties, focusing instead on its contributions to the war effort, which has included quadcopters, camouflage nets, and clothes. A significant portion of its 2024 budget will also be allocated to help finance the war. And in return, Moscow has been pouring money into Kaliningrad to help mitigate the impact of Western sanctions and bolster the exclave's vast military infrastructure. Moscow has also shown great interest in preparing Kaliningrad to operate independently, mostly via infrastructure projects that would reduce its dependence on neighboring countries just in case it becomes cut off from the Russian mainland. And bolstering Kaliningrad's autonomy is probably a good idea, given NATO's continued expansion that includes the accession of Finland and Sweden into the alliance. At this moment, as the NATO net surrounding Kaliningrad gets increasingly tighter, the Baltic Sea is beginning to look more like the NATO Sea. But what this really means for the isolated exclave is that it doesn't need any more problems with its neighbors. Wedged in between the NATO and EU member states of Poland and Lithuania, Kaliningrad relies heavily on its neighbors for food, but also remains dependent on mainland Russia for a number of other necessary goods. And every year, millions of tons of Russian oil, coal, and coke, a carbonaceous material used in the production of steel, are transported by rail through Lithuania. Over the past several years, however, the relationship between Lithuania and Russia has gotten increasingly rocky. For one thing, right around the time of Russia's massive Zapad 2017 military exercise, Lithuania built a new border fence. And for two, Lithuanian helicopters have been known to hover over the railway when Russian military trains are passing through, possibly conducting surveillance. Following Putin's invasion of Ukraine, though, things have gone from bad to worse. Due to EU sanctions, nearly half of all the goods that would normally pass through Lithuania, in or out of Kaliningrad, including coal, metal, construction materials, and various modern technologies, are now banned from entering any EU territory. And even before these rail sanctions, there was the implementation of the EU's flight ban, which forced Lithuania to close its airspace to flights from Russia to Kaliningrad, forcing commercial carriers to use a longer route that took them out over the Baltic Sea. Unfortunately, the people most affected by these sanctions are the people of Kaliningrad. In response, Kaliningrad's governor, Anton Alikhanov, assured worried citizens that regular ferry services from St. Petersburg would help soften the blow. For their part, Russia's foreign ministry has accused Lithuania of violating international agreements that facilitate transit from mainland Russia, while the Kremlin denounced Lithuania's actions as a blockade against its citizens and threatened ambiguous consequences. In its defense, the Lithuanian foreign ministry said it was simply complying with EU sanctions and clarified that the transit of passengers and non-sanctioned goods to and from Kaliningrad through Lithuania would continue uninterrupted. But just to be on the safe side, Lithuania also ramped up its railway security measures and established a permanent helicopter presence over certain sections of track. However ruffled Putin's feathers might be, though, he better be careful not to bite off more than he can chew. Lithuania has been a member of NATO for 2 decades, which means that any direct military action from Russia will invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, obligating the entire alliance to come to its defense. During his 2022 State of the Union address, US President Joe Biden even pledged to defend all NATO territory, then expanded the US's troop presence in Lithuania by around 1,000 soldiers. Which brings us back to the Suwalki Gap. Stretching around 100 kilometers along the Lithuanian-Polish border, the gap separates Kaliningrad from the pro-Russian state of Belarus. So why is this a major concern for the West? Well, a fortified Russian presence along the gap would isolate Lithuania and Latvia from Poland and the rest of the EU. This is why a number of Western militaries believe that if war in Ukraine escalates into a full-on hot war with NATO, this corridor will be one of Russia's first targets. Because in the event of a conflict with Russia, the location of the Suwalki Gap would make it nearly impossible for NATO forces to reinforce the Baltic states. Russia could easily add heavy fortifications to this narrow strip of land, making it a potential death trap for NATO troops. Various wargame simulations have predicted catastrophic casualties if NATO forces attempt to pass through it, Putin's perceived willingness to sacrifice the lives of his troops would also give him a strategic advantage in using the Suwalki Gap to isolate the Baltic states and maintain his foothold in Kaliningrad. Hypothetically, Russia could sweep into the corridor simultaneously from east and west, cutting off Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia from the rest of NATO. But this move would also lead to an immediate confrontation between Moscow and NATO's many nuclear-armed members, which, if not de-escalated very carefully, could lead to an unprecedented catastrophe. If Putin does ultimately move against, let's say, Poland or Lithuania, it would certainly trigger NATO's mutual defense provision. But what NATO's actual response would be still remains unclear. For now, the Baltics' vulnerability to Russian aggression is central among NATO's many concerns. Exacerbated by Russia's actions in Ukraine, this has led to a shift in NATO's approach to security. And as they consider stationing more troops in the region to deter a potential assault, even skeptics now recognize the need for forward defense in Eastern Europe. The Suwalki Corridor's significance has taken the stage again recently, after Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki raised concerns about the Wagner PMC, or the Wagner Group, a volatile Russian mercenary group who is reportedly operating in the area. Intelligence reports have indicated that over 100 Wagner mercenaries have been deployed near the Suwalki Gap, in close proximity to Grodno in Belarus. Morawiecki's primary concern is that these mercenaries might be posing as Belarusian border guards or migrants as they try to infiltrate Polish territory in an attempt to further destabilize the region. Given how important Poland's military is to the region's defense, Putin might just try to exploit the historical tensions that exist between Poland and Lithuania surrounding the Suwalki Gap, a similar tactic he used in Donbass. The Wagner Group lost some of its credibility after a recent mutiny among its fighters, yet this also proved that the group was ready to employ brutal tactics to advance its mysterious political and military objectives. Supported by some influential Russian elites, the Wagner Group has attracted the attention of both the West and the Kremlin, which ultimately made a deal with them to end the mutiny. As a result, a significant number of Wagner fighters were relocated to Belarus. What's also concerning are the rumors that the Wagner Group played a role in the recent military coup in Niger, which ousted the country's pro-Western democratically elected government. Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin applauded the coup, and the new military leadership in Niger were quick to welcome the support. So, could the Wagner PMC act as a similar destabilizing force in Eastern Europe? That's certainly one of NATO's concerns at the moment. Putin's motive for enlisting these unruly mercenaries is likely not related to territorial expansion, but to probe NATO's resolve, using a series of strategically orchestrated moves. What can they do when the instigators are non-state actors, such as the Wagner Group? It's this ambiguity that gives Russia a buffer of plausible deniability. To stay ahead of this fiasco, NATO needs to rely on improved surveillance measures, enhanced intelligence sharing, and a unified approach to responding to such conflicts. Despite all the hype surrounding the Suwalki Gap, however, there are some who believe its importance has been overblown, that its perceived strategic significance stems from a misconception regarding its military value and potential vulnerability. For some, it's unclear just why Russia would need to physically close the gap or seize territory in the Baltic states to cut off potential NATO reinforcements. In a major military confrontation between Russia and NATO forces, geographical boundaries wouldn't really matter. Plus, the Suwalki Gap lacks natural features that would present any unique military challenges or opportunities. And besides, any aggressive action in the region would create significant political challenges for Moscow and likely lead to the invocation of Article 5, which Putin does not want. The military threat associated with the Suwalki Gap is also not one-sided. NATO forces could easily get the drop on Russian assets in the region, including those in Kaliningrad. In its efforts to secure the gap, Russia would also likely face a range of logistical challenges, similar to those they ran into during the invasion of Ukraine. If the gap's strategic value is taken too seriously, some analysts have warned the US and its NATO allies might be prompted to deploy a significant military presence to the region, which might only create other problems. Massed troops might just end up being prime targets for Russian long-range strikes. Putin would likely also interpret such a strong military presence as a potential threat, one capable of launching an attack on Kaliningrad or Belarus and perhaps provoking an exaggerated response. Heavily militarizing this region could also provoke other NATO countries to take action, ones that might have been previously hesitant to confront Russia, leading to further escalation of this already complex situation. This does not suggest that the region between Poland and Lithuania, which is an internationally recognized border between two NATO and EU member states, lacks strategic importance. But it might be a better idea to focus on the more vulnerable areas of NATO's eastern flank instead, the towns and communities in the Baltic countries, especially Latvia and Estonia that are nearest to the Russian border. Dispersal of military elements rather than concentration would create more opportunities for engagement with NATO military forces and likely be a better deterrent of Russian aggression. Another and perhaps bigger issue we should be concerned about right now is Russia's long-range missile capabilities, which do not depend on the Suwalki Gap to be effective. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in fact, Kaliningrad became crucial for Russia's defense strategy, which has consisted primarily of demonstrating its nuclear capabilities in the hope of deterring NATO intervention. Even if Putin has, in the past, been liberally threatening nuclear war, it's likely been more to influence public opinion and not as a serious threat of military action. History suggests that nuclear threats are rarely acted upon. Even in past conflicts such as the Korean War, not to mention the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russia didn't use nuclear weapons, which is why most experienced world leaders, keeping in mind the low probability of actual nuclear retaliation, are unlikely to be swayed or provoked by mere nuclear saber-rattling. And perhaps Putin has been catching on to this notion as well, because as of late it's been Russia's more nationalist hardliners calling for nuclear action, while Putin has been content to sit back and present himself as a force for reason, although never actually taking the threat off the table. Some of Russia's hardliners have even argued that an atomic blast in Ukraine, in Europe, or maybe in a test over Siberia will be the only way to reignite the fear of Russian aggression in the West. Former chairman of Russia's Federation Council, Sergei Mironov, who is now the leader of the A Just Russia party, said recently that any attempt by the West to enter the Baltic region would be a real red line, or rather a red button, that Russia would be forced to press. Mironov seems to think that just because Russia is a nuclear power, that it would be justified in using its capability to defend its territory. And by its territory, he means every Russian region, regardless of whether the West recognize it as such or not. Mironov also went on to repeat the usual Kremlin rhetoric about invading Ukraine solely in retaliation to NATO actions and to rid the country of neo-Nazis. This scenario, however, has become somewhat typical in Moscow, with Russian hardliners spouting off about using or testing nuclear weapons, while Putin presents himself as the sole moderator, holding back the dogs of nuclear war. Rightfully suspicious of Putin's cool attitude, American and European officials have begun to speculate. Several factors, they believe, have contributed to the Russian president's somewhat more rational approach to nuclear weapons. For one, he may still be recovering from the backlash from China, India, and others who warned him there was no justification for using nuclear weapons. He might also be feeling more confident about his position in Ukraine. Either way, he still found the opportunity recently to casually mention that Moscow had successfully tested a terrifying new nuclear-powered cruise missile, one with a global range that's part of Russia's expanding arsenal of strategic nuclear weapons. Putin has also warned that if Finland and Sweden join NATO, Russia would have no choice but to strengthen its defenses in the Baltic region, which would include the deployment of nuclear weapons. Lithuanian Defense Minister Arvydas Anušauskas, however, has long insisted that Russia has had nuclear weapons stored in Kaliningrad for some time. His claims have not been independently verified, but other reports have indicated that in recent years, Russia's nuclear weapons storage bunkers in Kaliningrad have been upgraded. Both Finland and Sweden have been official partners of NATO since 1994 and have made significant contributions to the alliance's missions. But on April 4, 2023, after Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan withdrew a series of objections, Finland became the newest NATO member, increasing the number of member states to 31, and paving the way for Sweden's application and impending acceptance into the Western Defence Alliance. The decision made by both of these Nordic nations to join NATO marks a significant shift from their historically neutral positions. But there's no secrets surrounding what ultimately inspired them. The invasion of Ukraine shattered the long-standing sense of stability in Northern Europe, which left both Sweden and Finland feeling increasingly vulnerable to potential threats. For many Finns, the war in Ukraine sparked haunting memories of the 1939 Soviet invasion, which resulted in the loss of significant territory and raised serious concerns about the security of Finland's border with Russia. Over the past decade, Sweden has also had to reassess its potential vulnerability. In 2013, Russian bomber planes simulated an attack on Stockholm. Then in 2014, there were reports of a Russian submarine lurking in Swedish waters. Then in 2018, there was the countrywide distribution of army pamphlets titled "If Crisis or War Comes," which hinted to the growing concerns regarding national security within the Swedish government. While both nations have been rightfully worried about potential repercussions from Russia, it became clear that NATO membership was a necessary step to ensure their security in a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape. Joining NATO will provide them with the same security guarantees under Article 5 as any other member. With Finland and Sweden deciding to join up, it seems that more and more of Putin's red lines keep getting crossed without retaliation. And as Western nations continue sending tanks and missile systems to Ukraine, not to mention training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s, President Biden and his NATO friends have seemingly begun to relax. To be clear, no one is saying that Putin absolutely won't resort to using nuclear weapons against Ukraine or its allies, especially if he starts to lose territory in Crimea, but as the war drags on, it seems less likely he will voluntarily kick off the apocalypse. Which is why, no matter how disastrous the war in Ukraine ends up, examining certain more realistic outcomes is helpful too. One issue of great future importance that has been widely debated among Western analysts is Russia's future ability to restore its military strength. For this matters, especially when we're looking at the future of the Baltic region, which will undoubtedly remain a crucial strategic junction for both Russia and NATO. For now, it seems that the substantial investment Moscow has made to modernize its military has been largely squandered, and that Russia's weakened economy likely won't be able to sustain any similar investment for many years. Whenever this war ends, it will also be imperative to restore the global framework for strategic, non-strategic nuclear arms control, to re-establish these agreements and standards that have been seriously eroded by the escalation of Russian nuclear rhetoric and blackmail will be especially vital for Moscow if it wants to be welcomed back to the international bargaining table. Certain members of Moscow's expert community, mainly risk-averse political elites and some senior military officials, have more and more begun to push back against reckless nuclear saber-rattling, recognizing the utter impracticality of nuclear warfare, especially given the state of Russia's armed forces. But still, Putin has adamantly rejected any proposal to reduce Russia's nuclear arsenal. So as it looks now, whoever comes after Putin will have the challenge of shifting the government away from a nuclear-centric, even nuclear-worshipping mindset. Putin's successor will also have to face the strategic reality that if the war in Ukraine is still going, they will need to de-escalate tensions in the Nordic-Baltic region to avoid a potentially unwinnable arms race with NATO. But for now, Putin is still in charge, and he seems perfectly content to rely on veiled nuclear threats to hopefully deter the West and possibly distract them from Kaliningrad's potential strategic importance. And this may work for a time, but time is what Putin seems to be running out of, as groups of increasingly vocal separatists continue to threaten Russia's hold on the Kaliningrad exclave. Ever since Kaliningrad became a Russian exclave, there have been whispers among native intellectuals about the possibility of one day achieving independence. For many years, there weren't any grassroots secessionist movements, but there was enough talk to spark fears of separatism in Moscow, fears that were largely fueled by objective factors like Kaliningrad's far-out geographical position, which makes it all that much more susceptible to foreign influence. After the Soviet Union collapsed, and on through the 1990s, there were repeated public calls for Kaliningrad to become the Fourth Baltic Republic. But because of the oblast's importance as home to Russia's Baltic fleet, which could no longer use ports in the Baltic countries, Moscow cracked down hard on that sentiment. But in the 21st century, as economic conditions have worsened, and the contrast between life in the exclave and life in Lithuania or Poland has increased, separatist sentiments are once again on the rise. As a result of this, the influence of Russia's state media also appears to be waning in the region, despite Moscow's efforts to combat what it's called a growing enthusiasm for Germanization and creeping separatism. These efforts have included expelling German-backed NGOs, launching campaigns against the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and dismissing academics with ties to cultural organizations in Germany. And as information remains scarce due to Kremlin censorship, assessing the true extent of support for independence proves challenging, with many residents remaining cautious about openly advocating for secession. Perhaps the loudest voice at the moment, though, is that of the Baltic Republican Party, or BRP, which was founded in 1993 by Königsberg natives, also known as Baltic Russians. In an uncommon display of protest, just before the invasion of Ukraine, protests erupted outside the Russian embassy in Warsaw, as members of the BRP demanded demilitarization of the exclave. A year later, an unauthorized and potentially illegal online referendum took place in 5 Russian regions. Some 95,567 people participated, about 19.4% of the population, and all the regions that were polled voted in favor of independence. Much of the information we have comes from reporting outside Russia or reports made prior to the war in Ukraine, so it's possible that results simply reflect the bias towards pro-independence sentiment among the participants. But if anything, the referendum still served as a potential reminder that there are still those eager for independence. Perhaps encouraged by the vote, despite the Kremlin's efforts to stifle separatist movements through censorship and media restrictions, the BRP believes secession from Russia is only a matter of time. To make their point, when referring to the exclave, the party uses the name Königsberg, the German name for the city before it was handed over to the Soviet Union after World War II, claiming that it rightfully belongs to Europe. Party membership, they also say, has been steadily increasing both within Königsberg and the region surrounding it. One day, one way or another, the war in Ukraine will come to an end. And when it does, the structure of the Russian Federation will almost certainly change. If Russia prevails, well, life in Kaliningrad will likely not improve, but there are also many other scenarios that could lead to greater autonomy and even full independence for the former German city. With that said, the Kremlin has no intention of losing any part of its empire and will therefore continue to crack down on separatism. Even with the support from its European neighbors, unless drastic post-war changes occur within Russian society, Kaliningrad's sovereignty may remain out of reach for some time to come. In the meantime, the desire to revitalize East Prussian culture and the goal of an independent Königsberg will persist, likely until the right time and conditions for making the first steps in this direction are met. Unfortunately, the future of the Kaliningrad exclave will largely depend on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And when it ends, the stage will either be set for freedom or the dream may die forever. It couldn't hurt to ask, with all the changes happening in the Baltic region lately, what are the chances Russia simply loses interest in Kaliningrad? Some might even say that when Finland and Sweden officially joined NATO, aligning themselves with Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, Kaliningrad shifted from a strategic asset for Russia to more of a burdensome liability. In a very short time, Russia's chances of creating a chokehold for NATO at the Suwalki Gap went from good to nearly impossible. And on top of that, NATO now has the ability to bypass the gap entirely, deploying troops from the north, across the sea, or via air routes, keeping their distance from Kaliningrad's missile batteries and anti-air defense systems. These developments have fundamentally transformed the strategic significance of Kaliningrad. So much so that the French Institute of International Relations recently declared that the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO has largely upended Russian strategic planning and that its goal to exploit military superiority has been lost. The report also pointed out that during the first phase of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia redeployed its most combat-capable units, including its Air Assault Division and Marine Brigade, to support its offensive operations there, while at the same time, all amphibious capabilities of the Baltic Fleet were dispatched to the Black Sea. Now these units are fully engaged in countering the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has left Fortress Kaliningrad largely undefended. To Russia's credit, they have maintained unrestricted access to Belarus, but its current shortage of forces limits the benefit of this alliance. Lately, Russian and Belarusian forces have come together for a number of military exercises, including the Zapad 2021 exercises, but it's mostly been Russia's aerospace forces that are using Belarusian airbases for attack missions in Ukraine. Russian ground troops have, too, been consuming large amounts of ammunition from Belarus's pre-war arsenal. It's Putin's deployment of non-strategic nuclear warheads to Belarus, though, that could create the most trouble down the road. Complicating things for Belarus even further was the arrival of several thousand Wagner mercenaries after the failed mutiny in June 2023. Lacking any real sense of organization or heavy weapons, these guns for hire simply weren't capable of turning the tide in Ukraine or posing any real threat to Belarus's NATO member neighbors. But they did, as mentioned earlier, stir things up around the Suwalki Gap. But even though they make them a bit nervous, Poland is fully capable of addressing the Wagner threat. What's less clear is why Putin thought it would be a good strategy to relocate this unstable group of mercenaries just 25 kilometers from his base in Avdiivka, the supposed location of Russia's nuclear warheads. With everything that's happened, regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, Russia has little chance of re-establishing its previous military authority in the Baltic theater, or even matching its regional forces with NATO's. Putin will probably continue to lean on trusted deterrent strategies like nuclear saber-rattling and so on, hoping that the West will take into consideration all the urban targets that are within reach of his Kalibr and Iskander missiles. Or he may just go all the way and openly deploy nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad. But in the end, these will only be half measures, and won't do much to shift the reality of Russia's crumbling strategic position. Perhaps the best future we can hope for right now is a post-Putin leadership that's less inclined to seek out militarized confrontation with the West, and instead look for opportunities to restore cooperation and stability to the Baltic region. But what do you think? Is Kaliningrad the key to dominating the Baltic region? What will happen if Russia manages to close the Suwalki Gap? Are all Putin's nuclear threats just noise, or is he actually capable of pressing the button? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. By now, the world has become used to belligerent boasts and claims from Vladimir Putin, but in January 2024, he issued what may have been his most provocative edict yet, one with implications that go far beyond his already aggressive foreign policy. Here's a question: does Putin really believe that Russia still has a claim to Alaska? What might we expect from him toward America's most remote state? Let's find out. On the 18th of January, Putin signed a decree which sets aside money to search, register, and legally protect Russian property outside the borders of the Russian Federation. The stated purpose was to allocate funds for the process of searching the real estate property owned by the Russian Federation, the former Russian Empire, and the former USSR. Once found, there would be due registration of property rights and legal protection of this property. The territories subject to such legislation and legal protection were not named directly, but the Russian Empire and its successor state, the Soviet Union, at times included large parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the American state of Alaska, and even isolated parts of the West Coast in the continental United States. Contrary to rumors that spread online in the aftermath of January 18th, the decree did not declare the Russian sale of Alaska in 1867 to be illegal. However, it was the latest instance of revanchist saber-rattling coming from Russian power centers. Some prominent Russian military bloggers, like the Two Majors Telegram channel, which has over 530,000 subscribers, were eager to see the decree be used as a basis for a new round of territorial disputes. Although their viewpoint has some influence, the military bloggers are not part of Russia's government, so we cannot take their posts as an indication of official policy. To see Putin's potential view on starting a territorial dispute over Alaska, we should first look at the history of Russia in the area, because Russia's record of territorial and cultural expansion is important in informing his view about his country's place in the world. Beginning in the 16th century, under Ivan the Terrible, Russia expanded in all directions at a rapid pace, and by the early 18th century, it was reaching the edges of the Eurasian landmass. In 1725, Peter the Great, victorious over Sweden in the Great Northern War, became interested in exploring the Northern Pacific and finding potential colonies there. He enlisted the services of the Danish navigator Vitus Bering in his enterprise. The strait between Asia and North America is now named in his honor. The first attempt in 1725 failed to reach North America, but Bering's second attempt in the 1740s succeeded. Although remote, the area was abundant in resources, especially the thick furs, which were also common in Siberia. Russia had long established its fur trade as a source of national wealth. Along this supply chain, Russian authorities would exploit the tribes of Siberia, exacting a tribute in furs at the trading posts it built in these vast open lands. The Tsars would then sell these furs in Europe at an enormous profit. Alaska strengthened Russia's fur trade in Europe and opened new markets too. After Russia established a presence in Alaska, adventurous frontiersmen and traders ranged through its territory, selling otter pelts to the Chinese. Catherine the Great created Russia's first formal Alaskan colony in 1784 at Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island. Its governor was one of Russia's most successful fur traders, Grigory Shelikhov. An Orthodox mission was established there too. Russian explorers went further south in the early 19th century. They even reached California, where they established Fort Ross in 1812. However, the colony, governed by the Russian-American company that Shelikhov founded, was impossibly remote from the Russian heartland for it to attract many settlers. Sea otter populations also declined from overhunting to the point of becoming extinct in certain areas. Populations have still not recovered today, and the otter remains listed as an endangered species by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Worst of all, the situation in Eurasia was changing. Russia had entered a period of strategic competition with the British Empire in Central Asia as part of its quest for a warm water port. It also lost the Crimean War to Britain, France, and Sardinia, which came to the aid of the struggling Ottoman Empire. Facing such pressures, Russia decided that it could no longer hold Alaska, whose profitability was declining anyway. It did not want to see the British Empire gain the territory, which should have been easy for it to do based on its holdings in Canada. Worse, Britain extending its North American holdings to Alaska would put it on Russia's Eurasian doorstep. As early as 1859, Russia offered to sell Alaska to the United States, but the country was in the midst of a national crisis that led to a civil war, which delayed the proceedings. Once the conflict had ended and Reconstruction in the South began, Washington was finally in position to make the purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867 for $7 million, or about $119 million in 2023 dollars, a price negotiated by then Secretary of State William Seward. The sale satisfied Russia's interests, as it provided a buffer and set the United States up as a counterbalance against Britain in the Northern Pacific. The reaction in America was to call the Alaskan purchase Seward's folly, but for the United States, the move was also useful to its own interests. It expelled Russia from North America and contained Britain in the Western Hemisphere, which it had long claimed preeminence over with the Monroe Doctrine. A gold rush in the closing years of the 19th century increased its population. Alaska became a formal territory of the United States in 1912 and the 49th state in 1959. The purchase and later statehood of Alaska meant that the United States and Russia share a maritime border. At its narrowest point between Cape Dezhnev and the Chukchi Peninsula in Asia and Cape Prince of Wales in North America, the Bering Strait is only 51 miles wide. The distance between Russia and American territory is much narrower at the Diomede Islands. The Russian Big Diomede Island is only 2.4 miles to the west of the American Little Diomede Island. In the accepted view of international relations, the sale ended any Russian claim to Alaska. It had willingly given up the territory, and both countries agreed on the present border. Putin, however, does not view the world in terms of defined nation-states entitled to sovereignty and territorial integrity within a strictly defined set of borders. These post-Westphalia and post-Versailles conceptions of the state are things which he believes to be expressions of a historical Western liberal universalism. He instead views the world as one of multiple civilizations or civilization states. This conception of statehood is one where the formal mechanisms of government power are primarily tasked with protecting a specific culture and its traditions. In whatever territory such culture and traditions are dominant, culture rather than politics or borders lies at the heart of statehood under his theory. Putin is not alone in this belief system. Xi Jinping, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan are all believers in this idea. Even Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been called a proponent of the civilization state viewpoint. The recognized national borders of the present do not matter as much in the civilization state conception of the world. What matters, according to this belief, is the presence of a cultural tradition. This is part of the reason why Putin considered Ukraine to not be a real state, but rather a fictional construction of the West's post-Cold War international order based on the Westphalian and Versailles system. To him, Ukraine is an extension of Russian civilization, especially because of the time Ukraine spent under the governorship of Russian authorities and the large presence of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people within its borders. To see whether he thinks the same way about Alaska, we will need to look at Putin and other Russian leaders' past comments. In 2014, during an annual Q&A session with Russian citizens, a woman named Faina Ivanovna asked him whether he would ponder trying to get the territory back, saying that it was something Russians would be very happy to see happen. Putin in turn asked her why she needed Alaska. He said that the American purchase of the territory was inexpensive and that people should not get worked up about it. However, the tone began to change after the invasion of Ukraine. In July 2022, Vyacheslav Volodin, chairman of Russia's State Duma, said that Russia could lay claim to Alaska in response to American lawmakers' attempts to appropriate Russia's overseas assets. He was not the only member of the Duma to make such comments. In March 2022, Oleg Medvedev said that Russia should start thinking about reparations for the damage done by the sanctions and the war itself. Part of these reparations could include the return of all Russian properties, those of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and current Russia, which has been seized in the United States, and so on. He even included the territory of Fort Ross and Antarctica, which he said belonged to Russia, because Russia discovered it. This language anticipated what would come in the January 2024 decree. In response to Medvedev, Alaska's governor Mike Dunleavy wished him luck, saying that there were hundreds of thousands of armed people in the state that would see it differently. In December 2023, another Russian lawmaker dropped hints that Alaska would be on Moscow's agenda. On X, a Duma member named Sergei Mironov suggested that American power around the world was waning and that Mexico should reconsider taking back territories it had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War of 1846–48. Meanwhile, he said, Americans should think about their future and about Alaska. Under the civilization state theory, Russian claims to Alaska would come from its previous colonization there and the presence of ethnic Russians within the American state. Although the colony never had a high population, Russian culture and traditions survive from that time. For example, many of the communities in Alaska today trace their names from Russian sources, including Unalaska, the largest town in the Aleutian Islands. Kodiak Island still has recognizably Russian architecture and traditions. Russian cuisine is common in Alaska, as are Russian last names. There are also more recent Russian arrivals to Alaska, such as those in the village of Nikolaevsk, which hosts about 200 ethnic Russians. This population originates with a group of arrivals in 1968, after a split from the Russian Orthodox Church. Their way of life is still recognizably Russian, although Americanization is slowly creeping in. The political connection between Russia and Alaska may have ended in 1867, but such a connection is of secondary importance to Putin and other Russian expansionists who believe that cultural ties are at the heart of a civilization and its state. Russian territorial claims in Alaska would come primarily from these ties. In response to a new Russian edict, a spokesperson for the US State Department laughed and said that he's not getting it, Alaska, back. In response to the State Department's response, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and prime minister of Russia, wrote on X that "We've been waiting for it, Alaska, to be returned any day. Now war is unavoidable." He accompanied the message with a laughing emoji, signaling that his message was a joke. The Institute for the Study of War was quick to point out that a claim to Alaska, if indeed the decree led to a territorial dispute, was not feasible, but that the reaction of the ultranationalist military bloggers like Two Majors is telling about how deeply entrenched revanchist sentiment is within some circles in Russia. Like Putin, these communities believe that the fall of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe that erased centuries of geopolitical gains for Russia. Russia's military bloggers have often been critical of the war in Ukraine, but because of the way the Kremlin has conducted the conflict rather than the invasion itself. For example, these voices have been critical of Putin's reluctance to issue an order for full national mobilization. These communities would likely support a territorial claim on Alaska, as Two Majors has already called for. For many reasons, a Russian military attack on Alaska is inconceivable, even without nuclear deterrence. A conventional attack would at a minimum require a complicated amphibious operation with full cooperation between the Russian Army, Navy and Air Force. Given Russia's problems in projecting power into its own backyard and its lack of a combined arms doctrine, this is an unlikely proposition. It would also be almost impossible for Russia to achieve surprise. The movement of necessary troops and equipment to the Russian Far East would be easy to spot with satellite surveillance. Even if this could be done, Russia would have to contend with the United States Navy and Air Force. An operation against Alaska is an absurd notion. But opening a territorial dispute over Alaska, however fictitious, could benefit the Kremlin in other ways. The Institute for the Study of War said that the Kremlin may use the protection of its claimed property in countries outside of its internationally recognized borders to forward soft power mechanisms in post-Soviet and neighboring states, ultimately aimed at internal destabilization. In other words, the decree could be seen as something of a grey zone operation. Russia's strategic partner China has demonstrated the effectiveness of grey zone operations against Taiwan and in the South China Sea. In the South China Sea, grey zone operations have seen an expansion of Chinese military presence. This expansion has led to a series of fortified artificial islands that have increasingly constrained the activities of other countries and international shipping in these economically critical sea lanes. On the Taiwan front, grey zone operations like constant sorties have steadily worn Taiwanese defenders down in money, material and morale. It's not out of the question that Russia could take a page from the playbook of its strategic partner. In a grey zone operation, Russia would not attack Alaska, but it could use the January 18th decree as a basis for a constant series of low-level military maneuvers. These maneuvers would force the United States to divide its resources and attention, concentrating more of them in this remote area rather than in Eastern Europe. There is recent precedent for this. In August 2020, the Russian Navy conducted war games near Alaska. According to Russian sources, 50 ships and 40 aircraft participated in the maneuvers in the Bering Strait with a series of practice missile launches. These exercises included the use of Onyx cruise missiles being launched at a target in the Gulf of Anadyr from the coast of the Chukchi Peninsula. At least one submarine also surfaced as part of this series of maneuvers. The commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy, Nikolai Yevmenov, said that these drills were the first of their kind in the Bering Sea and were part of Russia's efforts to expand its presence in the Arctic while protecting its resources there. The purpose of this exercise, he said, was for the Russian military to get used to the Arctic spaces as part of a build-up in forces to ensure the economic development of the region. The exercises saw an American response, with NORAD sending F-22 Raptors to intercept 6 Russian Tu-142 maritime patrol aircraft that stayed in the sky for roughly 5 hours and came within 50 nautical miles of Alaska. The intercept was the second time that summer. On June 10, 2020, 2 formations of F-22 Raptors intercepted 2 formations of Tu-95 Bear bombers. The first pair of Tu-95s was accompanied by 2 Su-35 fighters and an A-50 early warning and control aircraft. The second pair of Tu-95s also included an A-50 and got within 32 nautical miles of Alaska, although all of the Russian aircraft remained within international airspace. Another incident that strayed close to Alaska occurred in March. NORAD says that intercepts of Russian aircraft in the skies near Alaska are common, which only makes sense given the close proximity of American and Russian territory. However, Moscow has built up its military infrastructure in the sea, improving and expanding facilities in the Arctic region, including enhancements to runways and the stockpiling of additional air defenses. Such infrastructure could be used to launch a concerted campaign of grey zone operations, would allow for Russia to introduce chaos into American diplomacy and military planning. It would take attention from the State Department and force the Defense Department to put more of an emphasis in the region, as Russia gradually encroaches on it with repeat grey zone operations. There is also precedent for enemy operations against Alaska. The Japanese landed on the westernmost Aleutian Islands in 1942 and were only expelled after a campaign that lasted for a year. Russia need not stage a similar campaign on these remote outposts to catch the attention of Washington. Increased grey zone operations near North America would at least disrupt American strategy. The mere assertion of a legal mechanism in American territory can be considered a psychological grey zone operation, forcing policymakers in Washington to guess at how serious Russia is about it. More realistically, the January 18th edict is the latest expression of Putin's expansionist philosophy. To him, the dissolution of the Soviet Union meant the end of centuries of Russian gains in what he largely considers a tragedy for Russia and for the ethnic Russians who live in the post-Soviet states that were once part of the USSR or the Russian Empire. He has called the demise of the Soviet Union the end of historical Russia. On December 12, 2021, as he was amassing forces for his invasion of Ukraine, Putin hinted at the extent of his strategic ambitions. We turned into a completely different country after the fall of the Soviet Union, and what had been built up over 1,000 years was largely lost. He said that 25 million Russian people were now cut off from the motherland by being within the borders of the newly independent countries, a fact which he called a major humanitarian tragedy. Putin denied that he was planning on attacking Ukraine, but we saw what his word was worth 2 months later. Putin may lack the power to extend this worldview to the once imperial Russian holdings in North America, but the post-Soviet states in Europe and Asia do not have the benefit of being part of American territory. In the January 18th decree, we see further hints of how far he would be willing to go if given the opportunity. We should not be surprised if new, more aggressive legal edicts regarding the former Soviet and Russian imperial territory come out of the Kremlin in the near future. Perhaps Putin's view is that Russia can historically gain territory but never legitimately lose it. In illustrating this viewpoint, the Two Majors Telegram channel said after the edict, "We suggest starting with Alaska." Two Majors also said that the decree should include Dnieper, Ukraine, Bessarabia, the Grand Duchy of Finland, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and the central states of Russian Turkestan, most of the Baltic provinces, and a significant part of Poland. Do you believe this is what Putin is also thinking? Will there be new edicts from Putin regarding territory that had once been under Russian jurisdiction? What Russian grey zone operations, if any, might we expect in Alaska in the near future? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Vladimir Putin's ambition to intimidate NATO with his Ukrainian invasion has spectacularly backfired. Far from sowing division and halting expansion, his actions have galvanized the alliance, boosting defense budgets across the board and ushering Finland and Sweden into the fold. How's that for unintended consequences? Previously, we explored Finland's contributions to NATO. Now it's time to delve into Sweden's dramatic journey into the alliance. Why is Sweden's NATO membership a strategic nightmare for Putin's grand designs? For one, Sweden is seriously considering developing a sixth-generation fighter jet, and despite its historically low level of military spending, its army is highly advanced. But this is all just the tip of the iceberg. Stick around as we dive into all of the reasons Sweden terrifies Putin. Let's begin. Sweden formally applied for NATO membership alongside Finland in May 2022 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For both countries, it was the end of a long tradition of military non-alignment. At the time, Vladimir Putin dismissed the new developments, saying that the two countries joining the alliance would not constitute a threat in itself. Rather, he said that he would only consider it a threat if they deployed a new military infrastructure in their territories. The latter came with a backhanded warning of a response in kind. Privately, though, Putin understood how deep of a blow this is to Russian power in Europe, and he must have been hoping that internal controversy would prevent them from joining. To admit a new member to the alliance, all NATO countries must be in agreement. Turkey stalled entry for Finland and Sweden, claiming that the two countries harbored members of Kurdish groups that it recognizes as terrorist organizations. Finland and Sweden's prohibition on arms exports to Turkey in response to its military operations in Syria in 2019 was also an item of complaint for the Turks. In the Turks' resistance, Vladimir Putin had a hope. Turkey is a purchaser of Russia's S-400 air defense system, which has earned it the ire of the United States. Turkey has also proven a vital lifeline for Russian energy exports and is now Moscow's fourth largest customer. Turkey has also gone through a period of democratic backsliding under Erdogan, who has been in power there in one form or another since 2003. Might the Turks prevent the two new countries from joining after all? Finland proved better able to overcome the Turks' objections, and it joined the alliance on April 4, 2023. Sweden, however, still saw its membership stalled, with Ankara claiming that Stockholm was being more intransigent about its concerns than Helsinki had been. At a summit in Madrid in July 2022, Sweden and Turkey agreed on renewed counter-terrorism cooperation both in and outside of NATO's framework. Additionally, NATO would establish a new office, the Special Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism. However, Turkey claimed that Sweden was dragging its feet on these commitments, particularly as the latter's courts blocked extraditions of individuals that it considered terrorists. Protests in Stockholm, where copies of the Quran were burned and Turkish President Erdogan was hanged in effigy, caused further diplomatic tension. Turkey said that this amounted to a hate crime, while the Swedes said it was an item of free expression. Then there was another obstacle. Hungary also objected to Sweden's NATO membership. Budapest's objections were not specific like Ankara's had been, but Stockholm's accusations about the supposed erosion of the rule of law under Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was an item of dispute. The Hungarians denied this and claimed that Sweden's accusations made it a less than trustworthy partner. After complicated diplomatic maneuvering, where Sweden changed some of its domestic laws and relaxed rules over its arms sales to Turkey, the Turkish parliament finally voted to permit Sweden to join NATO in January 2024. Then on February 26th, the Hungarian parliament followed suit. The two countries signed an arms deal as part of this agreement. The agreement included Budapest's purchase of 4 Gripen fighter jets and expanded pre-existing logistics contracts. Vladimir Putin's last hopes had run out. Sweden's entry into the alliance became official when it submitted its instrument of accession to the United States government, which is NATO's depository as outlined in the North Atlantic Treaty. This occurred on March 7, 2024. Although NATO has frequently been criticized for adding members of questionable utility and exposing its members to security commitments that might undermine the collective defense principle enshrined in Article 5, Sweden is not such a case, and it adds a lot to the alliance. First, Sweden's entry into the alliance brings renewed geostrategic vulnerabilities for Putin. The fall of the Soviet Union severely constrained Russia's ability to influence the Baltic. Its current projections into the sea come only with the small enclaves around St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. Post-Soviet Russia's only choice in the face of this new reality was to heavily fortify Kaliningrad and use it as the center of an anti-access area denial strategy through a buildup of aircraft, anti-ship missiles, and anti-aircraft missiles. Through these, Russia hoped to undermine NATO movements in the Baltic and threaten the commerce of its member states. In effect, Russia attempted to do to the Baltic what China has attempted to do to the South China Sea through its island-building campaign. Sweden's entry into NATO is a grave threat to this post-Soviet strategy. It has the largest coastline of any Baltic nation, allowing for free access to and from the North Sea, making it a maritime transit hub that's much more difficult for Russia to disrupt. Sweden's island of Gotland in particular is a strategic area. It's a key pivot point in the Baltic and only 250 kilometers north of Kaliningrad. This is the perfect area for a forward military base, one that can threaten Kaliningrad and carefully observe Russian activity in the area. It's impossible for Russia to send troops and supplies between St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad without transiting close to Gotland. In anticipation of its importance, Sweden is remilitarizing the island as part of its entry into NATO. It's only a matter of time before Stockholm equips it with A2AD assets of its own. Therefore, in any conflict, Kaliningrad will be surrounded and extremely difficult for Russia to reinforce and resupply. Additionally, Sweden's accession to NATO opens up alternative ways to reinforce the vulnerable Baltic states. The Suwalki Gap, the short border between Poland and Lithuania, which is sandwiched between Kaliningrad and Russia's vassal state of Belarus, has long been considered NATO's biggest geostrategic weakness. A pincer movement of Russian forces between these two lines could cut the Baltic states off from their NATO allies by land, while Russia overwhelms them with great numerical superiority over a short front. But with Sweden in the alliance, the Baltic states can now be reinforced through a direct sea route that Russia is in a poor position to dispute. Sweden joining the alliance makes the Baltic, for all practical purposes, a NATO lake. Russia is now surrounded by hostile coastlines in the Baltic Sea, making it practically impossible for it to transit its ships through the area. In any confrontation, NATO is in position to take control of the sea and cut off Russian trade while reinforcing hotspots as needed. Sweden not only brings geographical advantages at sea, but also on land. Its accession to NATO and the reunification of 2 centuries of military non-alignment also opens an unbroken land corridor between Norway and Finland. If either country were to be attacked along its respective borders with Russia, Sweden can act as a supply and troop transit hub for the other. Sweden's accession to NATO also comes with military advantages. Though often lampooned as being somehow effeminate and lacking vigor in its military affairs, Sweden is better prepared for conflict than many of its European neighbors. Although it does not currently meet its NATO benchmark of 2% of GDP on defense, spending only 1.3% in 2022, that number has steadily increased from a low of 1% in 2018. Stockholm plans to continue with this trend and accelerate it. In 2022, Sweden claimed that it aimed to reach the 2% mark by 2026. In September 2023, Sweden doubled down on this, with its defense ministry saying that it would already meet NATO's definition of the 2% mark in 2024, since the alliance's definition is broader and includes more items than appropriations. Nevertheless, on an official defense ministry document, Stockholm insisted it would not be stopping there. The government intends to continue proposing additional resources in the coming years so that the military defense appropriations will equate to 2% of GDP. Sweden also has an advanced military, despite its historically low level of spending. Among its useful assets is a fleet of 122 Stridsvagn tanks, an upgraded variant of the German Leopard 2. Sweden agreed to send 10 of its Stridsvagn tanks to Ukraine in February 2023. According to the Oryx blog, Ukraine has since lost 6 of these, but they demonstrated their worth in an incident from October, where a Russian anti-tank missile destroyed one of the Swedish tanks. However, the crew survived. Sweden thus brings additional tanks to NATO's land forces, ones which protect the lives of valuable tank crews from common anti-armor weapons. Aside from its tanks, Sweden has about 8,000 other vehicles and 26 self-propelled artillery systems, but it's lacking in MLRS systems and towed artillery, as it has none of them, according to the Global Firepower Index. Entry into NATO and an increase in its military budget should reduce this deficiency. In the skies, the Swedes command a fleet of about 30 Saab JAS-39 Gripen aircraft. These 4th-generation jet fighters come packed with the Beyond Visual Range Meteor air-to-air missile, which entered service in 2016. These projectiles have a range of about 150 kilometers with a no-escape zone of 60 kilometers. The no-escape zone is the area where there is a high probability of a kill even when the target is notified of the incoming threat. The Meteor's 60-kilometer range for this is the largest among the world's air-to-air missiles. The missile is, according to Saab, highly resistant to active and passive countermeasures like chaff, flares, and electronic warfare. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Ukraine has asked Sweden for Gripen fighter jets, and in August 2023 claimed that Ukrainian pilots were already training on them. In December, Ukraine and Sweden officially began dialogue on whether to donate some of the latter's Gripens to the Ukrainian Air Force. Sweden's entry into the alliance also offers the potential for its air force to get even stronger. Finland, for example, began its F-35 program in December 2021, when Helsinki selected the Lightning II to replace the FA-18 Hornets in its arsenal. Finland ordered 64 F-35 planes in a deal worth about $9.4 billion. As early as 2014, Sweden signed an agreement to train together with Finland and allow NATO assistance in a crisis. Now that both countries are part of NATO, it's possible and even likely that Sweden will get its own F-35 fleet in the near future, especially since more foreign countries are already opting for it over Sweden's capable Gripen in international arms deals. Sweden has also expressed interest in being part of the multinational effort to develop a sixth-generation fighter jet. It was once part of the Global Air Combat Program alongside the United Kingdom, Italy and Japan, although it officially withdrew from the effort in November 2023. It remains to be seen if Sweden enters another effort to produce a sixth-generation fighter. That same month, Stockholm announced it would hold off on procuring a future fighter until 2031, after which it would assess risks and possibilities. What we do know is that Sweden is starting to think about a fighter to succeed the Gripen so that it can strengthen its air force against future threats. Either way, it will only get stronger over time thanks to the renewed commitments to its domestic defense and its seriousness about its role in NATO. But Sweden's most powerful addition to NATO's arsenal is not on land or in the skies, but on the seas. If Finland's entry provided an almost fatal check to Russian power on land, Sweden does the same on, and even maybe more importantly, under the seas. Although Sweden only has 5 submarines, 3 of them are of the advanced Gotland class. These submarines are powered by a novel method, the Stirling Air Independent Propulsion (AIP) system. Unlike most conventional submarines, the Gotland class uses liquid oxygen stored in onboard tanks to run diesel engines when the vessel's batteries need to be recharged. This means that they do not need to surface as part of this procedure, as a traditional diesel-electric sub must do. The AIP method not only comes with greater stealth, it also allows for deployment periods normally only seen with nuclear submarines, and indeed, consensus is that the Gotland-class submarine is the most advanced non-nuclear type ever built. Such long deployments are valuable assets for NATO, even in a defensive role. The Baltic is a narrow area with several natural choke points. Stationing Sweden's Gotland-class submarines in these choke points will enable their crews to listen in on and detect Russian submarines and other naval operations, increasing NATO's intelligence gathering capacity and its ability to defend vital infrastructure like gas pipelines and underwater communication cables, which Russian submarine crews are trained to find and disrupt or tap into. Sweden's submarines will also be able to stay there for weeks at a time, remaining on constant alert. Ironically, submarine operations in the Baltic have been a traditional weakness in NATO because with an average depth of only 60 meters, it's too shallow for nuclear-powered subs to operate in. And because the United States Navy's underwater vessels are all nuclear-powered, they have not been able to contribute to the security of the Baltic. The importance of this security is often overlooked, as the Baltic is one of the world's busiest shipping areas, accounting for roughly 15% of the world's maritime trade. Sweden's entry into NATO mitigates this security deficiency. The Baltic also has varying salinity levels due to the large amounts of rivers that feed it. This variation changes the buoyancy of a submarine and the amount of noise it makes. One must know these waters to stay silent. And because Sweden has been operating submarines in the Baltic since 1904, longer than any other country, it has institutional experience that no other state can match. Submarine Flotilla Commander Fredrik Linden perhaps best described the situation in an interview with Reuters. "We have expertise, which fills a gap, expertise that NATO doesn't have." 2 more submarines are scheduled for delivery in Sweden by 2028. This new type, called the A-26, will be able to launch remote-controlled or autonomous underwater drones to further increase intelligence collection and reduce risk to the crew. Sweden has a robust surface fleet too, with 35 fleet units in its active inventory as of 2024, according to the World Directory of Modern Military Warships. These ships are mostly light corvettes and offshore patrol vessels, but it will also bring 9 valuable mine warfare ships. At the very least, Sweden's entry into NATO adds to Russia's naval disadvantages in the Baltic. The Kremlin simply does not have the numbers or the firepower to compete with NATO's naval forces there, and it will not be able to do so anytime soon. NATO's combined navy has gotten much stronger with Sweden's membership, while the balance has tipped even more against Russia. For Putin, this is likely a big personal blow to his pride. Like many Russian rulers before him stretching back to Peter the Great, he has fancied his country as a sea power and has tried but failed to restore the Russian Navy's Soviet-era capabilities. Now Russia's access to the world's waterways is even further restricted, and it all came because of its latest dictator's own actions. But the Swedes don't intend to add to NATO only through air and sea power. Stockholm has every intention of doing so on land as much as it can. In that regard, the Swedes pledged to increase the size of their army by 30,000 personnel, with a 2025 timetable bringing the total up to 90,000. The 2024 budget includes investments in order to make this happen, such as increased appropriations for officer training. The new troops will be a welcome addition to the forward missions of NATO's multinational battle groups, which have been deployed in increased numbers to the countries bordering Ukraine since the start of the invasion. In the worst-case scenario, Sweden's bigger army will constitute a nearby reserve on an immediate call to help the beleaguered and outnumbered Baltic states. Sweden also has a reserve force of 32,900 personnel, plus 25,000 paramilitary troops. It has a total manpower reserve of 4.2 million. Overall, Sweden's military is ranked 29th in the 2024 list provided by the Global Firepower Index. In addition to its existing military technology and assets, Sweden has a robust arms industry, despite its traditional neutrality. This gives the country a good foundation to actually carry through with its stated intentions on building a modern military. It's in a much better position to rearm than Germany, for example, whose frequent pledges to increase military spending have always fallen short. Sweden's arms industry will also be able to help other NATO members rearm adequately, and thanks to its strategic position, Sweden can serve as a convenient nearby hub to manufacture equipment and ammunition, which the war in Ukraine has shown gets depleted at a staggering rate in a peer or near-peer conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine deeply disturbed the nations of Europe. It was disturbing enough for Sweden to end over 200 years of military neutrality, which prevailed even during both world wars. In fact, the last time Sweden entered an armed conflict was in 1814 with the Swedish-Norwegian War. Thanks to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, that has now changed, and Sweden is arming once again. Historically, Russia was Sweden's greatest enemy, and Putin clearly recalled unpleasant memories for the Swedes, no matter how deeply buried they were. Putin may have wanted to weaken the transatlantic alliance through an easy victory in Ukraine, but his failure to scare the world with the Russian military might only have made his geopolitical disadvantage worse. With Sweden's imminent entry, NATO is now stronger, and the vice around Russia in the Baltic is all but closed. Russia is now at its weakest position there since the Great Northern War in the early 18th century. The Swedes under Charles XII lost that conflict, and Russia soon became the preeminent power in the Baltic. Over 2 centuries later, it almost feels like the ghost of Charles XII is finally having the last laugh. Russia's current dictator Putin may walk away from his war with some territorial gains in Ukraine, but for him, was it worth the balance of power tipping even more in NATO's favor thanks to Sweden's entry into the alliance? He can pretend all he likes that none of this bothers him, but holed up in the Kremlin, he probably isn't too happy about this development, to say the least. Meanwhile, Sweden is in a military alliance with all the other Scandinavian states for the first time since the Kalmar Union in 1523. Putin's aggression united the Nordic countries in a way not seen in 5 centuries. So much for weakening and overawing the West. What do you think about Sweden's accession to NATO? In what other ways might it alter European geopolitics? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go and check out Why is Sweden preparing for war with Russia? Or click this other video instead. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. This is the biggest country on planet Earth, with a total area of 6,601,665 square miles and a land area of 6,322,142 square miles. It represents 11% of the total world's landmass and is 1.8 times larger than America. But Russia isn't just a big country, it's a big problem. And if it collapses as a result of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, this will impact everybody, everywhere. Yes, even you. But why? And in what way? Let's find out. Send in the tanks. If you can find any. Russia has always prided itself on its Victory Day celebration. Held to commemorate the Soviet victory over the Nazis in World War II, the bombastic parade held annually in Red Square has historically served as a visual barometer of Russian military power. It is common to see rows upon rows of marching soldiers, jets, Tanks, armored vehicles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles file past an absorbed crowd and its approving leadership. This year, things were a little different. The Kremlin scaled things back, like a lot. There was no flyover, there were no Iskanders, there were 3,000 fewer soldiers, most of them cadets and students at local military universities. And rather than a steady stream of T-90Ms, T-14 Armatas, a solitary World War II vintage T-34 tank motored past the reviewing stand. For how staggering Russian tank losses have been in the Ukraine thus far, it's tempting to think this T-34 is actually the bottom of the barrel for Putin's forces. After all, having lost 192 tanks in the First Chechen War, 23 tanks in the Second Chechen War, and 3 tanks in the Russo-Georgian War, Russia has now lost an impressive 1,937 tanks in Ukraine thus far as of May 2023. And that is just how many have been visually confirmed. Just let that sink in. There are more tanks yet in Russia's arsenal, but most of them are currently employed in Ukraine, along with the lion's share of its military forces, explaining the humbler military parade presence than years past. Factor in the recent drone scare over the Kremlin, and we can see that this year's parade was held despite legitimate strategic red flags and security concerns unfathomable just 1 year ago. Some say the event, designed to capture the public's imagination and promote the heady militaristic nationalism of the Soviet glory days, is merely papering over the cracks in Russia's armed forces. Of these, there are many. The irony is that the last time the Russian military orchestrated a military victory of any consequence was exactly 78 years ago during World War II. Today, its operations in Ukraine are on track to follow a more common Russian pattern of strategic overstretch and ignominious withdrawal. There are increasing warning signs that the weaknesses we are seeing are evidence of far graver threats to Putin's regime. Recently, Yevgeny Prigozhin, chief of the Wagner mercenary group fighting around Bakhmut in Ukraine, criticized the Kremlin for not sending enough ammunition to make a difference on the front lines. "Victory Day is the victory of our grandfathers," he vented on social media. "We haven't earned that victory 1 millimeter." It should surprise no one that victory now looks far from attainable. On the contrary, in the light of economic sanctions and the declining financial health of the Russian Federation, some are predicting far worse for Putin's forces and his political future. With less to be positive about now than at any point in the war, could Putin's regime actually be on the brink of collapse? And what might that look like? In a recent survey of 167 foreign policy experts held by the Atlantic Council, 46% of them believed that the collapse or disintegration of Russia could happen in the next 10 years. 40% claimed that this would happen internally for a number of reasons, particularly because of a revolution, civil war, or political disintegration. We all know that wars gone awry can exacerbate and expedite the deterioration of a society faster than just about anything else. But Putin's abysmal strategic direction of Russia's war in Ukraine could have the country on the fast track to obscurity, oblivion, or far, far worse, outright dissolution. There are 2 prime historical touchpoints in modern history we tend to reference when we talk about a Russian political collapse, which is really saying something if you think about it. The first is the most recent, when the Soviet Union broke apart at the end of the Cold War. In case you're too young to remember, this collapse caught the world by surprise. Many were shocked to see a country so large and powerful, on paper at least, suddenly and rapidly fall apart. Some blame Russia's current state of affairs on the West's response to that significant geopolitical moment. Heralded as the start of a new era of freedom, liberation, and self-determination, many worried the independence of a host of ex-Soviet satellites and the weakening of Russia would destabilize the international order. Since the 1990s, all of the Soviet Union's 21 constituent republics declared themselves sovereign. Putin, a staunch imperialist who pines for the good old days, took this pretty hard. After he rose to power, the West tried to maintain dialogue and positive relations with the Kremlin, even as it embarked on a repressive imperialist foreign policy with deployments in the Second Chechen War, the 2008 invasion of Georgia, and the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. Since the end of the Cold War, Putin has created a regime that actively restricts the rights of the dozens of different national and ethnic groups within the boundaries of the modern Russian state. He wants to be a czar, with a wheel of dependent satellites to exploit for natural resources, manpower, and money. Russian officials and Kremlin propagandists have made it their goal to promote this agenda, making the ruthless look benign. Someday, who is to say Moldova, Kazakhstan, or other Central Asian nations might not come under the tighter thumb of Russian imperial aggression? What would it mean for European security? That's why Ukraine matters. The war there poses serious problems for Putin's imperial ambitions. He and his cabinet thought it would be a short war, one that would permanently bring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit. Instead, he is suffering one of the most catastrophic military setbacks of the past 100 years, one that has already surpassed the devastation caused by the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and one approaching the scale with the type of suffering that preceded the other major Russian collapse, the collapse of the Tsarist Empire in 1917. That, in case you forgot, was the first time the Russian Federation dissolved, the event that triggered Russia's chaotic, bloody descent into Soviet-era communism. And let me tell you, it was a whirlwind of a time to be alive. One moment you are a Russian soldier, fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary with the Entente allies on the Eastern Front. The next, you learn the inefficient and widely corrupt Tsarist government can no longer sustain the economic and material costs of the war effort. Before you know it, tens of thousands of soldiers, workers, and peasants are fed up, rising up, overthrowing the imperial government and installing the Bolsheviks in power. Countless Russian minorities yearned in those turbulent times for some form of recognition and freedom, which had been elusive under the Tsars. When the empire disintegrated and crashed out of the war, social, economic, and socio-political ruptures terminated the central control of the state and enabled the temporary formation of a series of new polities, including the Siberian Republic and other former territories that got their first taste of independence. These include Finland, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. It wouldn't be long before the Soviets, consolidating state power once more under the communist flag of the USSR, gobbled them back up. And you wonder why they were more than happy to join NATO in the aftermath of the Cold War. Most experts believe that a modern Russian collapse will be swifter, more brutal, and more akin to the revolutionary crisis of 1917 than the Soviet collapse of 1991. It is a possible scenario. The conditions in Russia today do bear a passing resemblance to those within the Tsarist Empire at the time of its fall. A deeply corrupt and morally bankrupt ruling class led by oligarchs, aristocrats, and elites with no conception of the economic suffering of the masses. Ethnic minorities in places like Dagestan, Ichkeria, Ingushetia, Ossetia, Kabardino, the Caucasus, Tuva, Buryatia, and others inhumanely treated, discriminated against, and used as cannon fodder in Putin's wars. A population in serious demographic decline, growing mistrust of Russian institutions and governance, intensive state oppression, a country that will owe billions, if not trillions of dollars, to rebuild Ukraine when the time comes. If you think any singular cause will cause Putin's downfall, you'd be wrong. History is non-linear, multi-causal, and contingent. Janusz Bagashki, author of Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture, put it best. The demise of the current Russian Federation is unlikely to follow a single path. Unlike that of the Soviet Union, where 15 Union republics became independent states almost by default, the fracturing of the state is likely to be chaotic, prolonged, sequential, conflictive, and increasingly violent. It can result in the full separation of some federal units and the amalgamation of others into new federal or confederal arrangements. Bruno Tertrace, an advisor for geopolitics at the Institut Montaigne, has argued that the only good thing about a Russian collapse today is that the nuclear issue would be far less serious than it was with the Soviet Union. Elites would be far more interested in preserving some semblance of authority and power rather than commit political and personal suicide by launching a nuclear attack. Most of Russia's nuclear forces today are inside the Federation, not beyond its borders like during the Cold War, when it had 7,000 nukes stationed outside Russia. Exploring the implications for Russia's future as a nuclear power if trends continue the way they are, Bruno observed, in the 1970s the Soviet Union was described as Upper Volta with rockets, he said. By the 2000s it was Mexico with nuclear weapons. In 2010s, a gas station with nuclear weapons. Will it become a Somalia with nuclear weapons? So how exactly might Russia collapse? What would it mean for its neighbors? We know that a country's foreign policy is a reflection of its domestic situation, and vice versa. In Russia's case, Putin's actions have the country on the path to economic Armageddon. The price of Russian crude oil is the lowest it's been in years. Within the first 2 months of 2023, the state had already fallen into a deficit level normally achieved in an entire year. It isn't profiting much from its sale of hydrocarbons to India and China. Its import sales are collapsing. Its GDP has shrunk by 4%. Air cargo fell by 60% in 2022. There has been a massive loss of technical expertise and specialized equipment as foreign corporations and businesses fled the country. It lacks vital semiconductors and other specialized machinery imported from the West, meaning its entire economy, to say nothing of its military power, is becoming more and more primitive. The net result is an increasing reliance on states like China for resources and technology, systems that can be integrated but take time. While that happens, poverty will spread, it will be harder to receive good healthcare, and the population will grow more discontent with the government. These factors could affect the strength of existing national movements or ethnic minorities within the Russian Federation seeking greater independence and autonomy. Moscow is far removed from many of these population centers and has, until now, relied on a technocratic system of oligarchical control where Kremlin-appointed elites receive massive checks to keep their provinces in line. These leaders, in turn, return the regional profits to the Kremlin's coffers. Russian elites are deeply dependent on Moscow's political and economic authority for their own legitimacy. When this goes bankrupt, what happens? When the public loses faith in these Kremlin-appointed governors and the Kremlin can no longer provide them with the support they need to maintain order, there's a chance that local separatist movements will grow. In resource and industrial-rich regions, there might be the temptation to cut ties with Moscow and go it alone with the support of the people. This happened in 2020, when mass protests erupted in eastern Khabarovsk after the arrest and 22-year imprisonment of Sergei Furgal, a member of the opposition party. This caused a power vacuum that Moscow had to fill. But it needs resources and support to do so. And with the war dragging on and the bite of sanctions becoming more and more acute, it is increasingly likely that Putin will struggle to plug the holes in the dike as the flood of discontent spreads. Unlike the Soviet Union, whose power rested on the Comintern and whose governing authority always had a reasonably clear line of succession, nobody knows what will happen in Putin's vertical, highly centralized hierarchy if the figurehead falls. Will there be a civil war? Will a power struggle ensue between Putin's elites? Will Moscow, already neck-deep in its military invasion of Ukraine, have the resources to suppress any separatist movements that arise? Back in 1917, this was the avenue that led to the downfall of the Tsarist Empire. Like falling dominoes, the Ukrainian Central Rada presented its first universal declaration. 5 months later, it declared the creation of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Other regions did the same. By the time you get to 1918, the Red Army was forced to suppress these movements and bring them into submission. Only Poland, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, states with active support from the United States, Great Britain, and France, the victors of World War I, managed to secure their independence, if only for a time. The Bolsheviks managed to set the ship straight, but it came at a massive cost. Putin has to hope his cronies are as committed as the Bolsheviks were when his grasp on power is brought into question. So far, one of his tactics has been to feature minority participants in the Ukraine occupation like Kadyrov's Chechens in his propaganda campaign for two purposes: to both show Federation solidarity in the war and, if things go sour, to have a scapegoat for the Russian army's broader operational failures. If Russia collapsed, it would probably start with a breakaway movement in one territory that spreads like a virus to others on the country's periphery. Chechnya, for example, could be the first domino to fall. They have a history of enmity with the Kremlin, after all, and a recent one at that. Local elites like Kadyrov will be posturing for greater political power if they start to glimpse fractures in Putin's existing political system. Already struggling to deal with Ukraine, how might Russia deal with discontented Chechen and Wagner mercenaries who, more loyal to the cult of their own determined rulers than they are to Russia itself, come marching back to Moscow? Could these leaders, fueled by vengeful hatred for the way they were left to die on the battlefields of Ukraine with too few weapons, shells, and dilapidated equipment, form a Faustian pact and team up against Putin? Or will battlefield defeat and economic poverty force these sides into internecine warfare amongst themselves, a battle royale for ultimate political power? Okay, it might be a stretch, and we should temper our prognosis just a little. While it's tempting to look at online maps depicting the collapse of Russia by 2025, with fantastical graphics carving the country up into dozens of independent republics, the reality is that Russia's internal divisions are far less stark than they appear. According to Alexei Gusev, a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the maps portray a delusion on the part of their authors that is common to many political forecasters. These observers, all map fetishists, mistake the administrative boundaries of Russia's provinces for real borders of socio-economic life, unaware that the true divisions in Russian society almost never coincide with the arbitrary lines drawn by Communist Party functionaries in the first half of the last century. Russia is extremely unlikely to disintegrate along its regional borders for geographical, sociological, economical, and political administrative reasons. Sociologically, Gusev argues, most of Russia's regions share the same basic values and attitudes. For those praying for Putin's downfall, just know this: Russia always ends up rebuilding itself. Preferentially, a new, more egalitarian form of governance would emerge from the ashes. Historically, hardship, defeat, and political turmoil have been the breadbasket of totalitarianism. As long as Putin remains in power, it is unlikely that Russia's collapse will resemble the peaceful disintegration of 1991. Putin looks set to run, in air quotes, naturally for president again in 2024. He'll be familiar with essays by the likes of Ival Ilyin, who wrote in 1950 what dismemberment of Russia entails for the world. He knows that battlefield victories will all but seal his grip on power for decades to come. But with a hard year of campaigning ahead, one in which Ukraine will slowly integrate new Western weapon systems into its counteroffensive strategy, Putin will be forced to drain Russian resources further, sending young men to die on the front lines. Hatred will grow. Putin will be forced to suppress these feelings to prevent widespread discontent. This begins a vicious cycle in which the only thing that can save his dictatorship is more suppression, which leads to more discontent. And you see where this is going. Edward Lucas, senior advisor and senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, put it best: as the butcher's bill mounts in Ukraine, the war story contains only stale bombast. The lie machine insists that black is white. The result is cognitive dissonance between what Russians experience in their daily lives and what the state propaganda machine is telling them. As we know from Soviet times, that can last for a long time, but not indefinitely. The whiff of change is in the air. The truth, more than anything, is that the cracks in the Russian power pyramid have been present since Putin came to power. His actions over the past year have only accelerated a process of decline already long in motion. It is fighting an unwinnable war. If it refuses to pull out of Ukraine and rebuild its military, it will soon be unable to prevent those who want to leave the Federation from doing so. If the oligarchs turn on Putin, will there be a struggle between intelligence services, the National Guard, and foreign mercenaries? Will Putin be assassinated? Russia has committed several grave geopolitical blunders throughout the past 100 years. Could this be their worst? Could Putin survive politically or physically a military defeat? Let us know in the comments. For more than a decade, Ukrainian troops held strong in Avdiivka. But by the time the demolished city fell into the hands of the Russians, only a few of the city's 30,000 pre-war inhabitants were left. Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade, which had been stationed in Avdiivka since the war began, held the line as long as they could. But when the last of the 110th withdrew from the city, the fears of Ukrainian leaders, as well as many experts, were realized. Will Ukraine lose their ability to put pressure on Russian supply lines passing through Donetsk? Many have been asking, could this be the turning point in the increasingly costly war that we've all been dreading? For 4 straight months, as the violence in Avdiivka reached its apex, the troops of the 110th demonstrated remarkable resilience, fending off a seemingly inexhaustible enemy. With the help of the Ukrainian Army's 47th and 53rd Brigades, who'd been guarding their flank with drones, mines, artillery, and even a few American-made M2 fighting vehicles, the 110th inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on a Russian force that was once 40,000 strong. Even when Russia's casualties were reportedly outnumbering Ukraine's by 7, even 10 to 1, Putin never let up. After months of what resembled trench warfare more than urban combat, Avdiivka was ultimately transformed into a ghost town, with its few remaining residents, perhaps 1,000 people, mostly living below ground, relying solely on humanitarian aid for survival. Through the winter, attacks of the energy infrastructure also left Avdiivka entirely without power. And yet, despite the relentless shelling and harsh conditions, some residents remained resilient, having adapted after nearly 10 years of living on the front lines to a much harsher life. But in the end, as the last of the 110th began falling back to the west of the city, they were forced to round up all remaining residents. Given the importance of Avdiivka, not just for its strategic military value, but also its propaganda power, this loss was not just a heavy blow to Ukrainian morale, but will also likely allow Putin to present his claim to the ruined city as a symbolic victory, helping him further justify his re-election. Throughout this war, but certainly in Avdiivka, we've seen an odd mix of modern warfighting capabilities: drones, modern battle tanks, precision-guided missiles, etc., and knockdown, drag-out battles for terrain that are reminiscent of World War I, where 100 meters, 1,000 meters are gained here and lost there, while an outrageous number of casualties pile up on the battlefield. We've seen these outdated tactics being used by both sides, but especially by Russia. The truth is, it's been a hard, long winter for both sides. Not long after the fighting in Avdiivka surged, back in November, a fierce storm lashed the Black Sea region, bringing with it widespread damage to southern Russia and Ukraine. Perhaps as an omen of the disastrous events to come, trees were uprooted, power lines were brought down, as coastal areas were thrashed and flooded. In the end, over 500,000 people were left without electricity. Emergency conditions were declared in various parts of the Crimean Peninsula as schools and hospitals shut down, and officials advised residents to stay indoors. In many areas, water and central heating services were disrupted, highways flooded, and low-lying areas had to be evacuated. Even Moscow got heavy snowfall, with drifts reaching as high as 25 centimeters, 3 times the usual amount for that time of the year. The storm was said to be part of a weather system that created blizzard-like conditions in Romania, Moldova, Bulgaria, and Serbia as well, and was declared one of the most intense storms ever recorded. But even as the storm passed, the bloody battle for Avdiivka continued. As one of the most fortified settlements in Ukraine, Avdiivka has been called the gateway to the provincial capital of Donetsk, located only 6 kilometers to the south. But even if Russia controls much of the region, Ukraine's control of Avdiivka has long prevented it from fully utilizing Donetsk as a much-needed communications and transportation hub. Avdiivka also had one of the largest coke plants in Ukraine, the Avdiivka Coke and Chemical Plant, which was crucial to Ukraine's industrial infrastructure, as coke is a key fuel used in making steel and other industrial processes. Before it was destroyed, this plant was not only vital to the war effort, but to Ukraine's economy in general. With everything that's happened recently, it can be easy to forget the contest for Avdiivka has actually been raging since July 2014, when Ukrainian forces recaptured the city from pro-Russian separatists at the very early stages of what would come to be known as the War in Donbass. But the first major battle for control of Avdiivka would be fought a few years later, in late January and early February 2017. Sparked by a dispute over what was known as the Industrial Zone, a buffer zone located in the eastern part of Avdiivka between the newly declared Donetsk People's Republic and the Ukrainian army, a week of savage fighting broke out. Both sides accused the other of initiating the battle. Some reports say that Ukrainian soldiers seized a small stretch of road, which provoked the initial separatist bombardment. During this attack, DPR forces indiscriminately fired artillery shells, mortars, and rockets into mostly residential areas, leaving more than 17,000 people without essential services, prompting the Ukrainian government to declare a state of emergency. More attacks, consisting of both pro-Russian troops and tanks, were then launched on Ukrainian positions, but little progress was made, and soon, with the encouragement of NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, Russia persuaded the separatists to stand down. A ceasefire was called, but both sides had suffered around 25 casualties. 14 civilians were also reportedly killed. What would become the definitive battle for Avdiivka, on the other hand, would be exceedingly longer and more deadly. But should that come as a surprise? Perhaps we should have expected Putin to spend the winter pushing wave after wave of soldiers into the fray. What also might come as a surprise is that this battle actually began the week before Russia officially invaded Ukraine. Back in late February 2022, as Russian troops were massing at several points on the Ukrainian border, Russian attacks on Ukrainian forces near Avdiivka had already intensified, as small groups of separatist militants attempted to penetrate the city. Soon the Avdiivka Coke and Chemical Plant was hit by an artillery shell and would have to suspend operations. The damaged plant would remain a target for Russian artillery, however, until February 2024, when it was largely destroyed, before being fully captured by Russian forces. Nearly 20 months later, on October 10, 2023, the final assault on Avdiivka would begin. Since Ukraine launched its failed counteroffensive back in June, Russia has attempted very few larger assaults. Leading up to October, we've seen a relatively predictable pattern emerge. Given that neither side has had the capacity to launch the sort of massive attack that would result in large gains on the battlefield, we've mostly seen smaller units pushing ahead as far as they can, typically with a lot of artillery and drone support. After more than a year and a half of intermittent fighting, though, Russia finally launched its first full-scale offensive aimed at encircling and capturing Avdiivka. And it worked, even though they suffered huge losses on the battlefield. In the first few days of their offensive, Russian forces were able to capture roughly 4.5 square kilometers of territory around the besieged city. Then, after thousands of Russian soldiers had been ravaged by artillery fire, Ukrainian troops noticed a change in their tactics. They began to divide up into smaller and smaller formations, making each unit a somewhat less obvious target for Ukrainian shells. While at the same time, Russian airstrikes hammered at the city's defenses, Ukraine's outnumbered forces also took a beating from Russia's artillery, as well as hundreds of gliding bombs. To accomplish his goal, though, and take the city, it was clear Putin would be more than willing to take heavy losses in terms of both troops and equipment. Estimates vary, but the consensus of military analysts, pro-Russian bloggers, and Ukrainian officials seems to be that Russia lost more troops taking Avdiivka than it did during 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Exact numbers are nearly impossible to verify, as they're commonly inflated by the side inflicting the casualties and downplayed by the side suffering them, which leaves the true number unknown. But Russian casualties in Avdiivka are believed to be higher than the official number of Soviet dead in Afghanistan, which would put the total over 15,000, with at least another 30,000 injured. An unconfirmed source from the Ukrainian military command claimed that, at last count, in the region of Avdiivka, between January 1st and February 15th, their inflicted casualties mounted to 20,018 personnel, 199 tanks, and 481 combat vehicles. That's a lot of carnage for only 6 weeks of fighting. But this shouldn't be all that shocking. The Kremlin has always downplayed its willingness to carelessly sacrifice men and equipment. To try and overwhelm Ukrainian positions so that other troops can then progress forward, Russian military leaders have been known to deploy wave after wave of often poorly trained and unsupported soldiers. The use of outdated, careless tactics like these left the battlefield in Avdiivka and elsewhere littered with frozen Russian bodies. These largely suicidal attacks have been so widely reported, in fact, that they were given the gruesome nickname Meatwave assaults. Totally unconcerned with troop losses, Putin was able to make slow progress in Avdiivka and eventually force Ukraine to retreat. But Ukraine has suffered its fair share of casualties too, and not just during those final days in Avdiivka. President Zelensky has claimed that some 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died in this war so far, but most Western analysts say the number is significantly higher. Especially when it comes to key territory in the Donbas region, which has been mostly occupied by Russian proxies since 2014, both sides are going to fight it out to the bitter end. But Putin appears to be willing to pay almost any cost to accomplish his goals. Some military analysts have said that gaining full control of the Donbas would be enough for the Kremlin to publicly consider the invasion of Ukraine a victory, which could explain Moscow's willingness to trade as many lives as necessary to capture it. And perhaps the main reason Ukraine lost control is that its military leaders weren't willing to make the same sacrifices as Putin. Take, for example, the decision of newly appointed Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, who on February 17th called for the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces, just as the last Ukrainian supply routes into Avdiivka had come under serious threat. Leading up to this point, to soften Ukraine's defenses, Russian forces had been using roughly the same approach that had eventually worked for them in 2022, when they captured the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which was to basically obliterate anything larger than a mailbox. Which meant that after months of constant shelling and airstrikes, Ukrainian forces were left with little to no cover. So to avoid being surrounded in the open and hopefully preserve the lives of his men, Syrsky ordered them to abandon the city and establish new defensive positions on higher ground to the west and southwest. Pulling out of Avdiivka was the right decision, Zelensky told the Munich Security Conference immediately following the retreat. Russia had nearly surrounded Avdiivka, and the total losses of the 110th would have been catastrophic for Ukraine's fighting capacity. Besides, a tactical retreat doesn't necessarily lead to a wider strategic loss, for with the right weapons and adequate ammunition, the Ukrainians could still be able to disrupt Russian supply lines going through Donetsk. We need to keep in mind too that it took Russia months to capture just 30 square kilometers in and around Avdiivka, and for now Ukraine still has a solid foothold in the Donetsk region. So it's still unclear whether Russian troops will immediately be able to put Ukraine's new defensive line to the test. But if the Russians do continue to put pressure on Ukraine, despite their losses in Avdiivka, along with more troops and a boost in morale, the Ukrainians will likely need the United States to start coughing up some ammunition if they hope to fend off another full-scale attack. Otherwise, Putin might just achieve the victory he's been prophesizing, but only if he has enough troops left in reserve to hold his hard-won territory. Because at this point, it's still unclear whether or not the Russian military has the manpower to exploit the situation created by Ukraine's retreat from Avdiivka. From here, Russia will also likely be attacking a series of well-entrenched positions, a course of action that puts the assaulting force at a far greater risk of sustaining casualties. Advancing troops are often dangerously exposed, compared to those fighting from a trench, and recovering wounded or dead soldiers from the battlefield becomes a highly dangerous challenge. But if Ukraine doesn't receive some much-needed American aid soon, most military analysts say they're not optimistic about Zelensky's chances for success in 2024. As the war enters its third year, both sides are struggling to find enough men to continue fighting with the same level of intensity. Russia, however, has a population 3 times that of Ukraine, about 144 million, which gives it a significant advantage in a war of attrition. This strategy will only work, however, if Putin is able to mobilize more and more soldiers. When the war began, hundreds of thousands of men fled the country. Then in September 2022, the Kremlin decided to call up some 300,000 conscripts, the first draft of its kind since World War II, which not only rattled the nation, but damaged Putin's carefully constructed image of normalcy. Since then, the Russian government has tried to put off another round of mobilization for as long as possible, boosting financial and legal incentives instead, hoping to attract convicts, debtors, migrants, and members of other vulnerable social groups to volunteer for duty on the front lines. Russia has also begun to strictly enforce the country's previously lax policy regarding mandatory military service for young men. For different reasons, a shortage of troops has become a grave concern for both sides, meaning that the losses suffered during the battle for Avdiivka were duly felt. For neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians wanted nor could afford a repeat of what happened in Bakhmut. The battle for Bakhmut, a city located on the Bakhmutka River about 90 kilometers north of Donetsk, kicked off in early August 2022 after Russian forces advanced from the city of Popasna following a Ukrainian withdrawal there. What took place after that has not only been considered the bloodiest and longest battle of the Russo-Ukrainian War, it's also been called one of the bloodiest infantry-on-infantry brawls since World War II. The main assault force consisted primarily of pro-Russian mercenaries from the controversial paramilitary organization known as PMC Wagner, or the Wagner Group, who were supported by some regular Russian troops and elements from the DPR. By November, attacks on the city had intensified, as Wagner fighters were reinforced by units coming from the Kherson front and newly mobilized recruits. By this time, too, much of the front line had descended into staggering trench warfare, with both sides paying a huge price for every meter gained. Only by sending waves of former convicts straight into the Ukrainian lines was Putin able to gradually end the stalemate, and by February 2023, Russian forces had captured key territory in both the north and south of Bakhmut, nearly encircling the city. Ukraine's forces had no choice but to slowly withdraw, which resulted in weeks of fierce urban combat. A month later, Russian forces had captured the eastern half of the city up to the Bakhmutka River and were continuing their advance into other Ukrainian-controlled areas. And by the end of May, the Kremlin was claiming they'd taken full control of the now pulverized city. After 8 months of heavy fighting in a city with a pre-war population of approximately 72,000, only 4,000 residents remained, mostly living in underground shelters with no access to water, gas, or electricity. Once a popular tourist destination known for its sparkling wine produced in underground caves, its broad tree-lined avenues, lush parks, and late 19th century mansions, Bakhmut was reduced to a smoldering wasteland. Even as he denied Putin's assertion that he'd captured the city, Zelensky compared the visible devastation of Bakhmut to Hiroshima after it was hit by the atomic bomb. Despite the fierce struggle to control it, initially Bakhmut was not regarded as a target of great tactical importance, but it would ultimately become one of the central battles of the Russo-Ukrainian War so far. Similarly to what occurred later in Avdiivka, as the battle raged on, the city itself gained a level of symbolic importance for both sides, largely because of the heavy investment of manpower and resources it was taking to claim it. For both the Ukrainian and Russian militaries, the Battle of Bakhmut has been described as a meat grinder, some of the fiercest urban combat in Europe since World War II. The intensity of the fighting and number of casualties has even led some experts to compare Bakhmut to the Battle of Verdun during World War I, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing during the nearly year-long struggle between the dwindling armies of France and Germany. In the end, the best Ukraine could hope for in Bakhmut was to keep the Russians bogged down along this small but tactically significant 1,500-kilometer stretch of front line as they depleted both their resources and morale. But as their own ammunition supplies ran low, Ukrainian forces lost their strategic edge, and the Russians were able to seize Ukraine's flank. Supply lines were disrupted, and casualties surged. In the last days before Russia announced its possession of the city, Ukrainian fighting positions had been whittled down to just a handful of crumbling buildings. Outnumbered and outgunned, pinned down by constant Russian bombardments, the Ukrainians continued to be hit by waves of mercenaries. When their defensive positions finally gave way, however, and a tactical retreat was ordered, it was too late. The delayed retreat would ultimately compromise Ukraine's advantage and result in scores of unnecessary casualties. These heavy losses would damage the reputation of certain generals, who were harshly compared to Russian leaders known to be careless with the lives of their troops. This misstep would also eat away at the Ukrainian public's trust, dampening their already waning enthusiasm for voluntary military service. Still, Ukraine's losses were a fraction of Russia's. According to the head of PMC Wagner and other sources, the mercenary group lost over 20,000 soldiers over the course of the nearly year-long battle, while another 60,000 were injured. But other experts believe these estimates are probably low, by a few thousand at least. What's completely clear to everyone is that in Bakhmut, and more recently in Avdiivka, even though the capture of the city could be considered a major victory for Russia, it came at a tremendous human cost. A cost even the most reckless leaders would be hesitant to pay, but then again, Putin isn't most leaders. Knowing that if he loses the war in Ukraine, it will likely be the end of him, a former Russian diplomat Boris Bondarev has said that Putin would be willing to sacrifice 10 to 20 million Russian soldiers to win. Initially, Putin had planned for this war to be very short, 1 or 2 weeks, but now he must win at all costs. Way back in February 2022, when Russia moved missile launchers, combat aircraft, and nearly 200,000 troops up to the Ukrainian border, many feared the worst. But a quick Russian victory never came. Instead, the Russian military has continued to sustain staggering losses. At this point, it's believed that well over 100,000 soldiers have been killed. According to the Ukrainian military, that number could be closer to 300,000. Thousands of pieces of armored equipment and several squadrons of fighter jets and helicopters have also been lost. It didn't take long for a well-planned strategy to give way to brute force and repetitive attacks as Russia's military became unrecognizable from what it was at the start of the conflict. Since then, Russia has had to rely on massive involuntary troop augmentations, and to replace equipment, they've been tapping into older and older stocks. Even as the Kremlin has upped the nation's defense budget and tried to accelerate production of defense equipment, the Russian military has continued to take a beating. And yet, Putin hasn't let up, clearly choosing an offensive approach as he continues to swap out apprehensive generals for more obedient ones. As we saw in both Avdiivka and Bakhmut, the Russian command has maintained a high tolerance for losses and has no problem sending unprepared troops onto the battlefield. At some point, the Russian military may not be able to compensate for its lack of trained soldiers, non-commissioned officers, junior officers, and various specialists who have been lost. But Putin shows no signs of abandoning his current strategy. He seems willing to sacrifice the lives of as many Russians as it will take to secure his own future. With that said, not every Russian soldier who's been killed in Ukraine was sent to their death by Putin. Putin does in fact command a loyal following among certain segments of the Russian population, especially in the more rural areas outside of Moscow, although it's highly likely that many of his supporters have been highly influenced by Russian propaganda, which enthusiastically portrays Russia and its peoples as victims of Ukrainian and Western aggression. For most Russians, though, military service feels more like an obligation than a choice, and there are harsh penalties for anyone who gets called up to serve but fails to report for duty, which is why many have chosen the uncertainties of war over the guarantee of harsh imprisonment. During its long history of authoritarian rule, Russia developed a broader political culture where blind obedience to the state largely became the norm. But the history of Russia during times of war goes against this subservient narrative. During World War I, for example, huge numbers of Russian soldiers deserted the trenches and returned home to participate in the emerging revolution. In World War II as well, battalions of soldiers surrendered to the Germans or joined the Russian Liberation Army and began fighting for the other side. So what might encourage Russian troops to take similar action now, actions that might just save their lives in this war? There are several factors that might just provoke a shift in the mindset of an already weary Russian soldier, most of which have already happened or are imminent. These include heavy battlefield losses, dim prospects for victory, and ongoing mass mobilization efforts. Perhaps the thing that might end this slaughter for good, though, is Putin falling gravely ill, dying, or being removed from power. And it's not unrealistic to think that getting rid of Putin might be the only way this war comes to an end anytime soon, because the Russian president has shown no indication that he plans to change tactics or step down. According to Dr. Ken DeClaver, an American psychiatrist who spent over 25 years analyzing antagonistic foreign leaders, the key to understanding Putin's motivations, actions, and decision-making process are the 3 R's: resilience, ruthlessness, and rationality. Putin would not have risen to the heights he has without resilience and ruthlessness. But when it comes to rationality, DeClaver does not mean the dictator possesses sound reasoning, but that his actions are rational according to his individual perspective. Tragically, Putin seems to view the invasion of Ukraine as a rational act. How else could he willingly bomb maternity clinics, schools, civilian centers, and energy infrastructure? Heinous acts that, according to the 1948 Genocide Convention, could easily be considered war crimes. Putin's pattern of rationalizing irrationality extends beyond the current conflict in Ukraine to previous actions such as the events in Chechnya in the early 2000s, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and the involvement of the Russian forces in Syria, most notably in Aleppo, starting in the 2010s. When looking at Putin, DeClaver also highlights the concept of revengeism, which can be observed in his obvious desire to redraw Russia's borders to their pre-1991 arrangement. And it's this mentality that's led to the disruption of a post-World War II order that's been instrumental in maintaining peace in Europe for over 70 years. But what can be done with a leader who doesn't care that the international community despises him? The old Putin before 2022, and perhaps as far back as 2018, might have cared to some extent that most everyone thinks he's a monster. The one who embarked on a diplomacy tour throughout Europe following the attempted assassination of former Russian military intelligence officer Sergei Skripal. At one point, Putin did appear to be concerned with rehabilitating his diplomatic image, but as the war in Ukraine passes its 2-year mark, he doesn't seem to care all that much. And as his inner circle continues to shrink, his indifference regarding public opinion has too. Now he only seems to care about achieving his goals, regardless of what the rest of the world thinks, including his allies. In the wake of the shocking events on October 7th, Hamas's savage attack on Israel, followed by Israel's violent campaign to oust Hamas from Gaza, much of the world turned their attention away from Russia and Ukraine. But this conflict is far from over. We must keep track of what's happening on the front lines over there, for letting this historic war slip from the global consciousness would be a big mistake. The outcome of this conflict will undoubtedly have serious long-term consequences that extend far beyond Eastern Europe, as long as Putin remains in charge. Of that, you can be certain. In a recent interview with former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, Putin claimed that prior to the invasion, Russia and Ukraine had nearly reached an agreement, but at the last minute Ukraine backed out, choosing instead to obey the instructions of certain European countries and the United States, opting to fight Russia to the bitter end. For this setback, Putin especially blamed former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was himself forced out of the UK Parliament in June 2023, claiming that Johnson personally dissuaded Zelensky from signing a truce early on in the conflict. Putin didn't have anything good to say about President Joe Biden either, claiming that the last time they spoke, which was apparently before Russia invaded Ukraine, he told him he was making a mistake of historic proportions by pushing Russia away and supporting Ukraine. Carlson's reasons for setting up the interview were fairly obvious: entertain his right-wing audience and provoke his enemies on the left. And although he was warned that Putin might use him as a propaganda tool, which is essentially what happened, he went ahead and traveled to Moscow anyway. Putin's reasons for agreeing to be interviewed by the former Fox News presenter are more complicated. One was probably to influence the current narrative surrounding the war in Ukraine, and the other was likely to reassert his historical grievances regarding US foreign policy. Putin has never been shy about his feelings, about accusing Washington of self-harm, of being unable to think in strategic terms, and of failing to understand his own interests. He claimed repeatedly that the US intends to spark new wars and disrupt the world order. But maybe the interview with Tucker Carlson was his attempt to re-establish a dialogue with the US, not with the US political mainstream, of course, but perhaps with highly visible conservatives like Carlson, former President Donald Trump, and billionaire Elon Musk. In Putin's mind, these people could become powerful allies in the future. He seems to be thinking more long-term than the upcoming US presidential election. For the most part, the Russian leader sees the US as its own worst enemy, a system that's doomed to collapse. Sure, he sees a second Trump presidency as a good way to weaken the West and deprive Ukraine of support, but who's occupying the White House is a secondary issue. What he actually wants is for the US to become a country that he can either fool completely or bend to his will. During the interview, after giving Carlson a lengthy and controversial history lesson, Putin was often vague and stubborn, remaining heavily focused on issues that he felt strongly about, instead of directly answering the questions being asked. Despite Carlson's intentions, this only made it more clear just how ideologically misaligned Russia and the West actually are, given it was nearly impossible to establish a coherent dialogue, even between Putin on his best behavior and one of the most irrationally conservative men in America. But what do you think? In war, do the ends always justify the means? What number of casualties is acceptable if the broader strategic goal gets achieved? What makes Putin so willing to sacrifice the lives of his own troops? Will his disregard for his own soldiers be the reason he loses the war in Ukraine, or the reason he wins it? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out how Putin is failing to defend Crimea, or click this other video instead. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. What would it be like if the Soviet Union could be reconstructed? Would it have the same power it did in the Cold War? Putin sure seems to think so. He once said that the fall of the Soviet Union was the disintegration of historical Russia. The Soviet Union's collapse instead turned the current Russian Federation into what Putin calls a completely different country, and what had been built up over 1,000 years was largely lost. He further laments it as a humanitarian tragedy, that the countries formerly part of the Soviet Union are now cut off from Russia. Putin made these remarks in November 2021, and they are an important revelation into his expansionist ambitions. But why exactly is Putin so convinced that reuniting the Soviet Union would restore Russia's former power? Let's start with the facts. There is little question that the fall of the Soviet Union harmed Russia's geopolitical position. What was once a single country broke up into 15 independent successor states, with the Russian Federation being the most prominent and the one that took on the Soviet Union's international position and responsibilities, such as its nuclear arsenal and permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. However, the Soviet Union's breakup forced Russia to retreat from many of the boundaries it had established for hundreds of years prior to the communist haven's existence. The Soviet Union and its predecessor, the Russian Empire, was once a formidable player in the Baltic. That position had almost entirely eroded, with Russia maintaining only a small presence on the Baltic coastline centered on Kaliningrad, which is not connected with the Russian mainland, and the city of St. Petersburg, which Peter the Great founded during the Great Northern War with Sweden in the early 18th century. Since its victory over the Swedes, Russia steadily gained more control of the Baltic coastline, but the fall of the Soviet Union reversed all of that. As a result, Russia's power in the Baltic is contained. Meanwhile, the sea has practically become a NATO lake, with Finland's recent membership and Sweden's membership in the alliance pending. If the Soviet Union were to be reconstituted, Russia's presence in the Baltic would greatly expand, and NATO's frontiers would retreat hundreds of miles further west, putting Russia in a much better position to buffer its territorial homeland and contest NATO's dominance in the waters. Further south, the entirety of Belarus and Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. This territorial extent allowed the Soviet Union far greater power projection into the European plane than its successor state enjoys today. It also had a much bigger buffer to protect the so-called Volgograd Gap, the narrow piece of land that connects the Russian heartland through the Caucasus to its southern border. This piece of land is vital for Russia's geopolitical position. If Russia were to lose control of it, it would also effectively lose control of the Caucasus, the Caspian Sea, and its remaining presence in the Black Sea. Crimea would be unable to be resupplied by land. It's no surprise that the Volgograd Gap became an object of some of the fiercest contention in both world wars, and was a primary objective for the German invasion of Russia on both occasions. Prior to the demise of the Soviet Union, there was a much narrower border, much further west of the Volgograd Gap than the one that exists today. The fall of the Soviet Union means that Russia has a much longer border to defend on the essentially indefensible terrain of the European plain, and the border is much closer to the Volgograd Gap than the one that existed in 1991, giving NATO far more leverage in its strategic position. If the Soviet Union's borders were to be reconstructed, NATO would be forced onto a narrower front, one much further to the west of the Volgograd Gap. Russia, or whatever the new state was to be called, would have much better options to pursue its foreign policy. It's no surprise that Putin questioned the existence of a historical Ukraine and was eager to announce a formal annexation of the occupied Ukrainian territories in the fall of 2022. Even as Russia's military was being pushed back on all fronts at the time, the more Ukrainian territory that Russia can occupy, the further to the west it pushes its supposed border away from the Volgograd Gap, and the easier it is to defend. If Russia were to succeed in restoring the Soviet Union's borders, it would be able to concentrate on a narrower front, stretching from the Polish border in the north to the Black Sea in the south, where the western borders of Ukraine and Moldova are today. NATO's options would be more constrained, and from the Russian perspective, the Volgograd Gap would be much better protected from the types of invasions seen in World Wars I and II that still give Moscow shivers. Restoring the Soviet Union's borders would also mean the vast increase in Russian influence in Western and Central Asia. The modern states of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and Tajikistan were all once part of the Soviet Union. The new country, whatever it would be called, would then almost entirely circle the Caspian Sea. The borders in Asia would come up to Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, while the border with China would be a lot longer than Russia's border with the People's Republic today. Controlling that amount of territory on the Eurasian landmass would give Russia more of a say in how resources there are managed. Central Asia hosts many valuable natural resources like coal, oil, natural gas, and metals like copper, and the rare earth elements that are at the heart of the modern digital economy. This region was also at the center of the old Silk Road trading network. Because of its position as a bridge between East and West, it is a region China has ambitions for with its Belt and Road infrastructure project, which is meant to more greatly connect China with Europe. Even though the Soviet Union is no more, Russia has always considered itself the leading figure in Central Asian politics and still does today. Although Russia and China have had better relations in recent years than in any recent historical memory, the latter's increasing encroachment into Central Asia remains a point of contention in Moscow. If the Soviet Union were to be restored, Moscow would have much greater leverage in its relations with Beijing, which the invasion of Ukraine revealed is undoubtedly the senior player in their strategic partnership. It would also have much greater leverage in its dealings with Iran, which has supplied it with many of the drones it has used in its war in Ukraine. Restoration of the Soviet borders would make Russia a much more formidable force in the Middle East as a whole. It would open up far greater opportunities for power projection there. Restoring the Soviet Union would do more than fortify Russia's geopolitical position, though. It would assuage some of Russia's demographic and economic problems. In 2023, the Russian Federation had a population of 144.3 million people, equivalent to about 1.8% of the total world population, and ninth among the world's most populated countries. However, the Russian population peaked in 1993 at about 149 million. It's expected to decline to about 133 million by 2050, which would make it the world's 17th most populated country. If trends continue, Russia will have a population of about 112 million people by the end of the century. Putin revealed much about his strategic aims with his announced annexation of the occupied territories of Ukraine, and it went beyond the addition of valuable geopolitical territory. The Russian policy was to give citizenship to the ethnically Russian population in the occupied Ukrainian areas, which, according to Moscow, bumped the country's 2023 population up to 146.5 million. This is still a drop in the bucket compared to the trend, however, and it will not stop the population decline. By restoring the Soviet Union's borders, though, the Russian Federation would restore the Soviet Union's population too, or at least as much of it as possible. Before its collapse in 1991, the Soviet Union had the world's third largest population. The 1989 census revealed a population of about 287 million people. The breakup of the Soviet Union split that population among many different successor states. Putin's annexation of Ukraine's eastern territories revealed his broader intentions. Restoring the Soviet borders is partly a method to reverse or at least arrest Russia's ongoing population decline. Ukraine's total population as of 2023 is close to 37 million. Taking over Ukrainian territory is partly a means to transferring its population to the authority of Moscow. Moldova has a population of 3.5 million. Russia has been involved in Moldovan politics by throwing its support to the pro-Russian breakaway Transnistria region. Russia also has about 1,500 troops in that area, and in the late summer of 2022, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned Moldova that any attempt to endanger its soldiers there would provoke an attack. Lavrov also said that Russia would protect Russian-speaking people in Moldova, such as in the region of Gagauzia. This hints at Russia's greater ambitions to restore Moldova to the authority of Moscow. Belarus has a population of about 9.5 million in 2023. Unlike other post-Soviet states in Europe, it has never receded from the sphere of Russian influence, with Alexander Lukashenko, its dictator since 1994, being essentially a vassal of the Kremlin. Yet this arrangement may no longer be enough for Moscow. In early 2023, a document titled Strategic Goals of the Russian Federation in Belarus was leaked to the public. It suggested that the Kremlin was eyeing a full annexation of Belarus by 2030, done through the means of a permanent Russian military presence within its borders, carefully staged information control and media integration, and making Minsk economically dependent on Moscow. Belarus's incorporation would not only add to Russia's population, but bring its borders to Poland, putting that country in a more vulnerable geopolitical position. Russia has particularly resented the post-Soviet independence of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These three countries' accession to NATO in 2004 effectively cut Russia off from much of the Baltic Sea. Estonia has a population of about 1.3 million, Latvia about 1.8 million, and Lithuania about 2.7. Incorporation of the Baltic states back into the neo-Soviet empire would add about 5.8 million total people to the Russian population. There are three post-Soviet states in the Caucasus. The first is Georgia, with a population of around 3.7 million. Georgia was one of the first indicators of Russia's expansionist ambitions under Putin. In 2008, Russia intervened militarily in Georgia, recognizing the breakaway republics of South Ossetia, with a population of about 56,500 according to Russian sources, and Abkhazia, which occupies a strategically important coastline and has a population of about 245,000 according to the Russian sources. Russia's attempt to partition Georgia may be seen as a stepping stone to its desire for reintegration of the whole under its orbit. In the southern Caucasus is Azerbaijan, with a population of about 10.4 million. Azerbaijan and Russia share warm relations. Despite Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Russia brokered a ceasefire in the 2020 war with Armenia. As part of the terms, 1,600 armed Russian peacekeepers were deployed to the Nagorno-Karabakh line. These troops also control the only road linking that area to Armenia. Russia and Azerbaijan have pledged to enhance their economic relationship, especially in the energy sector. Azerbaijan also has a law that prevents Baku from receiving military or foreign aid from the United States unless it renounces the use of military force to resolve its disputes with Armenia, further deepening its ties with Moscow. The other post-Soviet state in the Caucasus, Armenia, has a population of about 2.8 million. It suffered a defeat in the war with Azerbaijan in 2020 and is currently trying to unwind some of its security agreements with Russia. For example, it refused to host military drills in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, a post-Soviet military alliance. Azerbaijan is not a member of the CSTO, but the military alliance has not intervened on Armenia's behalf against Azerbaijan. It's becoming clear that the Kremlin is using Azerbaijan as a cat's paw for its policy in the Caucasus to force Armenia to go along with its wishes. In the longer term, Russian policy toward Azerbaijan may be to treat it like Belarus, as the FSB's assistance in putting down the unrest following the disputed presidential election of 2020 in that country forced the Belarusian regime further into dependency on Moscow. The Kremlin likely hopes that its intervention in Azerbaijan's disputes with Armenia will bring it closer to becoming a fully fledged satellite state. There are 5 post-Soviet states in Central Asia. The largest in territorial size but not in population is Kazakhstan, with about 19.6 million people. Kazakhstan reveals the demographic importance of this post-Soviet region, because unlike the former Soviet states to the west, including the still-growing Azerbaijan, it is expected to gain population between now and the end of the century. Demographers project that Kazakhstan will almost double in size to 34 million people by the end of the century. The same is true for Uzbekistan, the most populated country in the region with about 35 million people. In 2023, this makes it the most populated post-Soviet state after Russia itself and Ukraine. Demographers expect Uzbekistan to grow through the rest of the century, peaking at about 51 million people in the 2090s. Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan are much smaller, with populations of 6.7 and 6.5 million respectively. Yet they are also expected to grow. Kyrgyzstan is expected to reach a population of 12 million by the end of the century, while Turkmenistan is expected to peak at about 9 million in the 2080s. Finally, there is Tajikistan, with a population of about 10.1 million. It too is expected to grow, doubling in size to 20.4 million by the end of the century. In the immediate term, Russia would significantly grow its population if it were to re-establish the old Soviet borders. It would increase in size to 294.5 million people, nearly doubling from Russia's current population. This would make it the world's fourth biggest country by population after India, China, and the United States. In the longer term, a restoration of the Soviet borders would mitigate to some extent the population decline in the Russian heartland by adding areas expected to grow in population. Moscow would at least partially solve the issue of its population's declining birth rates. The Russian economy would also get a boost. Even before the war in Ukraine and the international sanctions it invited, Russia was far from being an economic powerhouse. Despite its ample resources and large population, the Russian economy was barely larger than Italy or Canada's, despite Russia having well over 2 times Italy's population and over 3.5 times Canada's. The Russian economy also shrank by 2% in 2022, thanks to international sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine. Russia is not an innovative or manufacturing powerhouse and does not enjoy internationally recognized products or brands. The most valuable part of its economy by far is its energy industry. The industry tends to range between 16 and 20% of Russia's GDP, with drop-offs in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic and 2022 because of war sanctions. As of the first quarter of 2023, the Russian energy industry bounced back to a historical normal, 17.4% of GDP, thanks to trade with countries like China and India, which plugged some of the gap left by the sharp reduction of exports to the European Union. Restoring the Soviet Union would add the economic output and resources of the former Soviet countries to Russia's economy, which had a GDP of about $2.24 trillion in 2022, following the invasion, ranking it 8th in the world. Adding the totals from Belarus $72.79 billion, Estonia $38.10 billion, Latvia $41.15 billion, Lithuania $70.33 billion, Ukraine $161 billion, Moldova $14.42 billion, Georgia $24.61 billion, Armenia $19.5 billion, Azerbaijan $78.72 billion, Kazakhstan $221 billion, Uzbekistan $80.39 billion, Tajikistan $10.49 billion, Kyrgyzstan $10.93 billion, and Turkmenistan $45.6 billion would increase the Russian economy to a total of about $3.048 trillion, putting it above France and almost on par with the United Kingdom's economy of $3.071 trillion in the world GDP rankings. Russia would be able to dictate more of the world's energy sector through its reserves and the reserves of the countries it absorbs into its orbit. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan in particular have abundant oil and natural gas reserves. Kazakhstan has an estimated 30 billion barrels as of 2017, while a 2019 study for the Leibniz Information Sector for Economics estimated Turkmenistan to have the world's 5th largest natural gas reserves. Reincorporating these countries with the Russian energy sector would give it much greater leverage in the world's energy market, especially since the European Union has long sought greater economic ties with these Central Asian countries in a bid to reduce its dependence on Russian energy, even before the invasion of Ukraine. Controlling these oil and gas reserves would give Russia greater leverage over Europe, reducing the latter's potential energy alternatives. Russia's economy would have the opportunity to diversify away from the energy sector if it were to restore the Soviet Union. For example, we've mentioned that the post-Soviet countries in Central Asia host valuable minerals and rare earth elements. Moscow centralizing control of all those resources would make negotiating for them tougher on buyer countries. There are other resources too. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, for example, have abundant gold reserves, and Tajikistan also has the Koni Mansour silver deposit in its north, one of the most abundant reserves in the world. Despite these resources, the Central Asian region remains heavily dependent on its energy sector and has failed to diversify its economy, much like Russia. Reabsorption to Moscow's authority would by no means guarantee that this changes course. Militarily, a reconstruction of the Soviet Union would mean that Moscow gains control over all of the armed forces in the former post-Soviet states. Their resources would be added to those the Kremlin controls. Russia already has the world's fifth largest military by active personnel, with just over 1 million troops. Adding all of the post-Soviet states' capabilities to this strength would make the new Soviet Union the world's second largest military, with over 1.5 million active personnel. In summation, a restoration of the Soviet Union would significantly increase Moscow's influence in the international system. It would become geographically, militarily, economically, and demographically stronger. However, there is no guarantee that these assets would be used to their fullest potential, much as they were not in the Soviet Union itself. As seen in the Soviet Union and in Russia's revanchist war in Ukraine now, and indeed the Russian Empire long before, mismanagement and corruption are common traits among various regimes in the Kremlin. In an interview for The New Yorker in March 2022, the Pulitzer Prize-nominated Stalin biographer Stephen Kotkin described Russia as historically being a relatively weak, great power, whose capabilities have never matched its aspirations. Although the West's foreign policy would need to change to meet the new challenge of a resurgent Russian power, in the long run there is little reason to believe that the historical pattern Kotkin pointed out would change. And it is for this reason that we have every reason to believe that a restoration of the Soviet Union any time in the near future is as fantastical as a restoration of the Roman Empire. But what do you think? What would a restoration of the Soviet Union do for Russia and its place in the international balance of power? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. How resilient is Russia? And is its eventual collapse possible or downright probable? Let's talk about it. Russian losses are frankly astronomical. To date, Western intelligence agencies report the Russian military has officially lost almost 90% of the crack air, sea, and naval forces it amassed at the start of the war. This includes thousands of tanks, a number approaching the total number of tanks possessed by the United Kingdom and Germany combined. It also includes tens of thousands of other mechanized vehicles, to say nothing of the 315,000 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing in action. A stark data point when you consider the fact that Russia only started its invasion with 360,000 troops. This scale of destruction for a great power dwarfs anything the world has seen in decades. Yes, the numbers are alarming. According to one declassified US intelligence assessment, the war has sharply set back 15 years of Russian effort to modernize its ground force, and all but ruled out its capacity to conduct meaningful offensive operations, which have failed to make major gains in Ukraine since early 2022. Another RAND study argued it will take years, perhaps even decades, for the Russian military and economy to recover from the damage already incurred. When you factor in the compounding operational and political red flags we've witnessed this year, bloodletting in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, political brinksmanship between the Kremlin and Prigozhin's mercenaries, the lack of any semblance of air supremacy, and the operational nullification of the Black Sea Fleet, to outsiders Putin's determination to press on and his dogged ability to cling on to the gains he has made appears almost miraculous, if not downright insane. Winter approaches, and it is a critical time for both Russia and Ukraine. Western funding packages teeter on the knife's edge, and Ukraine remains vulnerable. If, at the conclusion of its slow but ongoing counter-offensive, it cannot maintain the widespread political, economic, and military support it has enjoyed thus far, it will struggle to convince its global partners to keep their material pipelines open, and consequently, struggle to plan and execute future offensive operations into the new year. Russia has its own share of problems. Arguably, it's been fortunate to escape 2023 with much of its defensive front lines intact. Today we'll take a closer look at why, exploring not only how Putin continues to enjoy relative operational parity with his enemy, despite the endemic dysfunction we've seen in the Russian political and military apparatus, but how he has done so in the face of such grave military losses. After what was, in hindsight, an extremely disappointing year of Russian military setbacks, there was perhaps no greater symbol of the precarity of the Russian war effort than the whirlwind bout between Russia's mutinous mercenary leader and oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin and Putin's military cabinet led by Shoigu and Gerasimov. This was, for all intents and purposes, the biggest crisis in the Russian president's 2 decades in power, and it all started when Putin outsourced the battle for Bakhmut to the veteran armed contractors of Prigozhin's Wagner Group. As close friends and confidants, the two had worked together before, yet with each successive battle, Prigozhin's grumbling against his civil-military patrons grew more pronounced. At first, his popular Telegram videos, often posted from the front lines, called for arms and implements, bombs, artillery shells, and ammunition. As Wagner suffered upwards of 20,000 military casualties in Bakhmut, Prigozhin's tone changed. He seemed to finally realize systemic issues at play, that no matter how much equipment and tactical leeway Putin conferred on his troops, operational constraints imposed by Putin's military chiefs, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, rendered their sacrifices worthless. Prigozhin gave voice to a growing perception of strategic incompetence among the Russian military elite. Shoigu and Gerasimov could not keep their ill-trained conscripts in battle long enough to support the Wagner Group's advance, a reality tantamount to betrayal. He cited alleged instances of actual betrayal, fratricidal incidents he deemed deliberate. Prigozhin's inflammatory messages challenged Putin's legitimacy and ignited a blood feud between the Kremlin and the mercenaries last summer. This culminated in a shocking march on Moscow, where Prigozhin and 1,000 of his men mutinied and marched virtually unopposed up the M4 highway toward the Kremlin, capturing Russia's entire southern military headquarters sited in Rostov-on-Don in the process. Putin scrambled to extinguish the spreading spark of insubordination, while Moscow flung itself into a last-ditch defense of its major highways, airports, and government buildings. Putin publicly denounced Prigozhin and called for an orderly de-escalation of tension. Meanwhile, the world watched as the Russian state careened toward what seemed like its inevitable descent into anarchical civil war. This, however, never came to pass. A day later, the mutiny fizzled out. Prigozhin was whisked away into Belarus. A compromise settlement dropped all criminal charges in exchange for Wagner's removal from Russia, what was touted in the press as the beginning of the end for Putin's regime. In hindsight, looks as though it was simply a mere speed bump. The communist revolution at the end of World War I had proven sufficiently destabilizing to overthrow the Tsarist government. A costly intervention in Afghanistan had all but ended the Soviet Union's hopes of winning the Cold War and contributed to its sudden collapse. Yet the Wagner mutiny seemed to simply fade into oblivion. Its final act epitomized by published video of Prigozhin's smoldering plane falling quickly to earth. The Kremlin's run-in with Prigozhin was consonant with a seemingly unending slew of crises many commentators have been quick to cite as evidence of Putin's imminent collapse since the Russian president came to power. The rapidity with which Ukraine recaptured tens of thousands of miles of occupied territory at the end of 2022 was one such example. Then, as now, such prognostications proved misguided. Take as additional examples the countless media reports contemplating the consequences of Putin's alleged ill health, high-level defections which claimed he was losing his grip on his subordinates, and mass protests at the start of Russia's 2022 invasion. Similar cases stretch back into the recent past. These include Putin's gross mishandling of Russia's COVID-19 pandemic response, perceptions that Zelensky's election in 2019 might undermine his authoritarian grasp on power, fears that other political opponents like Russia's incarcerated opposition leader Alexei Navalny might emerge as viable presidential contenders, or that Putin's incremental territorial revisionism, including his annexation of Crimea, invasion of the Donbass, and intervention in Georgia, might inflame global opinion and make Russia a political and economic pariah. Winding straight back through Russia's mid-2000s bungled responses to domestic terrorist attacks and the knock-on effects of the tanking Russian economy during the 2008 global financial crisis, and you see that part of Putin's political genius, if you can call it that, is his cockroach-like ability to roll with the punches. Public confidence in Putin remains high. He enjoys an 80% approval rating. Not that he has much competition these days. There isn't much incentive to challenge him on a grassroots level. Thousands of ordinary Russians were jailed as part of the country's fiercely repressive response to any and all anti-war demonstrations over the past 2 years. In the political realm, Alexei Navalny, Russia's most viable opposition leader, is doing 30 years in a Siberian penal colony with no credible promise he'll be released even if he completes his sentence. In light of its steep military losses, Russia's economy appears not only intact, but poised for rejuvenation after enduring what many in the West considered the most crippling set of financial constraints ever imposed. In 2022, these measures were highly effective. Russia lost access to $300 billion of its foreign exchange reserves in G7 countries almost overnight. The ruble contracted by a quarter against the US dollar. Price caps penalized Russian oil sales, and Russian industrial players and banks suffered punishing export restrictions on mundane and specialized resources alike. Like their leader and their military, wily Russian economists have slowly adapted to these sanctions. By the end of 2022, the Russian economy had contracted by 2.1%, an order of magnitude less than the almost 30% hit sustained by Ukraine. As bad as this was, it still wasn't as bad as the Russian economy got during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. But what really boggles the mind is the recent prediction, forecasted by the International Monetary Fund, that Russia's economy is actually set to grow in 2023 and 24, as it more than doubles its military spending, identifies workarounds to import forbidden goods via third-party countries, and by employing a shadow fleet of oil tankers and fraudulent bookkeeping to undermine the oil price gap. The West has reportedly imposed more than 13,000 sanctions on Russia since the start of the war. Have Western sanctions failed? Is the spike in Russian military spending artificially masking deeper economic vulnerabilities? Are Western nations going too easy on export controls? Ultimately, can Western economic pressure help compensate for Ukraine's battlefield setbacks over the long term? Answers to these questions aren't easy to come by, yet bound up in them is a partial explanation for why Putin's regime has proven so resilient. Russia not only has seemingly boundless quantities of natural resources like oil, gas, and coal, it retains contact with nations who, regardless of the moral implications, are keen to receive said resources at reduced prices. In some cases, their very development depends on it, and this has serious implications for Russia's military in Ukraine, because Russian power is directly correlated with its economic prospects, and because its economic prospects remain, relative to their operational situation, stable for the moment, it's unlikely Putin's regime or his military will collapse anytime soon. Here's what you need to know about the Russian economy. It's one of the world's only true petrostates, with a quarter of the globe's natural gas reserves, 15% of its coal reserves, the sixth most oil reserves, and a population nowhere near large enough to consume it all. Russia's income hinges on massive exports to neighboring consumers who, themselves, lack access to such resources. Russia's economic dependency on foreign exports cannot be overstated. The oil and gas sectors account for almost half of its annual budget, after all. Over the past few decades, Russia has sought to maximize its profits by selling cheap energy in the form of oil and gas to regional communities like the EU. They spent years building pipelines across Europe precisely to facilitate the exchange of these types of goods. And then Putin invaded Ukraine. Fearing the renewed threat to its own territorial sovereignty, Europe quickly lost its appetite for Russian goods. Joining in support of Ukraine, the EU decided to take the measures in tandem with the United States and other nations to rapidly revoke Russia's right to export goods to Europe. This started by limiting Russian seaborne imports of oil. They also ended the inflow of natural gas through the Nord Stream 2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea, replacing it with gas from the United States and Qatar. Russia soon found itself locked out of Europe. It was sitting on a mountain of resources and nowhere to sell it. This, however, didn't happen overnight. The Western world couldn't afford to prevent Russia from selling its goods elsewhere, nor could it enforce such a policy even if it wanted to. Yes, if it could, then, shorn of almost 50% of its annual budget, the Russian military would almost inevitably collapse. What you would see would be global economic anarchy as a tenth of the world's oil supply simply dropped out of circulation overnight. Markets would fail. Inflation would skyrocket more than it already has. Amidst greater scarcity, the cost of oil worldwide would skyrocket to unprecedented levels. So if the West can't afford to cut off Russia's energy exports altogether, what has it done? In the short term, the answer has been to impose what is known as a price cap sanction. The West continues to allow Russian companies to ferry their goods worldwide and engage on the international market insofar as they agree to sell their goods at or below a benchmark price. In the case of oil, where most countries can sell a barrel anywhere between $70 and $80 per item, Russia has to decide whether it wants to continue selling at traditional outlets for a fraction of the price the G7 countries can make, or if they want to look for new clients elsewhere. Looking elsewhere might not be as good as it sounds. While it can certainly find willing buyers for oil sold at Black Friday level markdowns in places like the Far East, Asia, Africa, and South America, geographic proximity figures heavily in making the whole operation make financial and logistical sense. This is why they were so heavily invested in Europe in the first place. Right next door, it only cost Russia about $3 to ship a barrel west. Rerouting these shipments to the global south doubles the cost of shipping. Not only that, but it makes it harder for the Western firms who traditionally handled much of the original trade routes to buy in. Russian shipping companies quickly found a workaround. Let's just contract a bunch of foreign shipping firms to deliver our oil to the far reaches of the globe, they reasoned. Working with intermediaries outside the Western gaze would enable them to circumvent the $60 per barrel oil cap and make significantly more than they otherwise could. Russian companies found traders willing to work new routes, re-registered others in countries without sanctions, and quickly found an agreeable system. The more tankers flocked to Russian ports, the lower freight rates became. Another surprising benefit for Russia. Over time, the use of a shadow fleet of more than 500 antiquated shipping tankers from companies mostly registered in the Middle East, Africa, China, Latin America, and even Russia enabled Russia to divert many of its original export goods into new markets. The West has tried to respond by imposing a new round of sanctions on tanker owners participating in the sale of Russian oil based in Turkey and in the United Arab Emirates. Yet the West is still trying to devise ways to combat Russia's ability to sidestep the effect of their sanctions altogether, at least in the realm of energy exports. While the oil price cap worked throughout 2022, about midway through 2023, Russia had managed to deliver most of its oil sales away from the EU and US routes into far less familiar Asian and Far Eastern markets. To its surprise, it found neutral nations like India eager to gobble up its cheaper stockpiles. Today, Indian consumption of Russian oil has skyrocketed from a high of 3% in 2021 to about 40% in 2023. By comparison, its original primary supplier, Saudi Arabia, has seen itself increasingly edged out of the market. China is more involved in Russian oil imports, with competition equally fierce between Russia and Saudi Arabia for the critical Chinese market. The impasse has forced both to come to a mutual agreement to curtail their oil production by as much as 300,000 barrels a day to reduce the size of their burgeoning surplus. This, they predicted, would raise the price of each barrel in turn and increase revenue. In the West, the fluctuation of global oil stock prices has forced nations like the United States to increase their production to record highs just to offset the inflationary knock-on effect of Russia and Saudi Arabia's decision. The result is an ongoing global oil struggle, with the East and West locked in a deadly cycle as each attempts to constrain the other while keeping their own economic lifelines intact. These measures have seen global oil prices skyrocket well above even the targeted cap price, enabling Russia to add far more revenue than it otherwise could. At home, Russia is gearing up for the economic long haul. It knows the longer it can keep Ukraine in limbo, the greater chance it will have to curtail the pipeline of Western aid. Experts at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for example, claim Russia's announced 2024 budget hints that it's ramping up the mobilization of its economy in order to sustain a longer war. For the first time in modern history, they write, the country is set to spend 6% of gross domestic product on the military, and defense spending will exceed social spending. The war against Ukraine and the West is not only the Kremlin's biggest priority, it's now also the main driver of Russia's economic growth. What this means is that Russia's defense spending is now the highest it's been since the Cold War, one-third that of its most consequential partner, China. Russia has realized that the more it spends on the war in Ukraine, the more it's able to replenish its dilapidated defense industry. If the conflict stagnates, all the better. It can continue to pump money into its military-industrial complex, which then trickles down into domestic society as a whole. The State Duma predicts that revenues will triple into 2024, social spending will increase sevenfold, education, healthcare, and the like will remain steady, and inflation will be negligible. It's all looking rather good. How exactly does that work? Isn't Russia unable to match the current rate of loss among its military? Won't massively inflated military spending programs doom an already shaky Russian economy? Yes and no. Russia currently has a lot of financial responsibilities. Foremost is the fact that it has to pay its recruits about $2,000 a month. That is, when they actually pay on time. This, by comparison, is around 3 times the national median monthly salary for military-aged males. The fact they can earn far more in the military than they ever could working in a factory deep in the Urals provides a strong personal incentive to join. What's more, if they die, which seems very common these days, Putin promises their families a $52,000 bonus, 3 times the median annual salary for a Russian family. There have already been more Russian war dead in 2 years than the United States lost in Vietnam and the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan combined. What that means is that there have been a lot of payouts to the families of the deceased, along with government-subsidized mortgages, pensions, and other salaries. And what that means is that there has been a massive influx of expendable income pumped back into the Russian economy, which has more than compensated for negative fallout from sanctions imposed by the Western powers. The path ahead is relatively clear for Russia. It doesn't need to print out an ungodly amount of extra cash to make it all work. All it has to do is maintain its historic deficit while their oil and gas revenues recover, and Bob's your uncle. According to one commentator, Russia can afford to run at its current deficit level for a half a century until it comes close to approaching current American levels of debt. That's a startling observation. Today in Russia, defense production is in full swing. Its civilian industries are matching pre-war production levels, and Russian unemployment is at an all-time low. Yet we feel we should issue a word of caution. It won't all be sunshine and rainbows for the Russian war economy moving forward. Russia's defense sector is historically inefficient in its management and profitability. For example, in 2022, a Russian state-owned defense conglomerate known as Rostec actually managed to make less income from the sale of weapons and military equipment in 2022 than it did in 2020. The Russian space agency is hemorrhaging cash. One state-owned shipbuilding corporation is in the same boat, pun intended. Experts believe the projected growth in Russian military spending is an attempt to keep pace with these costs. As the ruble continues its steady devaluation, the cost of military equipment will only rise. Similar to its shadow fleet, Russia has tried to sidestep the impact of sanctions by purchasing critical Western-made components like semiconductors, computer chips, lasers, and other technological equipment from unsanctioned border countries like Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan at a slightly marked-up price. The same thing is happening in China and Turkey. Today, the West is trying to find new ways to incentivize these countries to stop these practices, but trying to control Russia's access to far-flung global markets is like trying to control a many-headed hydra, similar to attempting to limit oil exports using crude price cap controls. If you eliminate one market, another presents itself. In order to truly slow down the Russian economy, a country or coalition of countries would have to essentially sanction not only Russia, but every country adjacent to Russia, and do this with such strict measures that Russia becomes virtually sealed off from the outside world. As we've discussed today, doing this would not just impact Russia's own ability to functionally subsist, but would inject chaos into the global marketplace. With certain countries entirely dependent on Russian business and energy exports, this is simply impossible. Russia has a way of surprising us, however, and just might find a way to implode its own economic lifelines all on its own. Demographically, Russia, like many countries, possesses an aging population in terminal decline. The more fighting-aged men it deprives from its labor force, the harder it will be to increase industrial productivity, something it will inevitably have to do if the war escalates in any way. Sweeping conscription drives are already unpopular and will continue to be so as they impact the economy's ability to remain afloat. With spending so skewed towards the defense sphere, social spending will suffer. Russia's dependence on tech imports to maintain its military effectiveness means inflation will continue to creep higher and higher. This will leave the Kremlin with few options. Abandon the war altogether and seek rapprochement with the West, an option Putin seems remiss to adopt in light of the fact that it would cause a significant shock to the Russian economic system, or he can simply lock the country in for the long haul. Overhauling the economy to remain on a war footing indefinitely may result in short-term prosperity, relative to what things were like in 2022 at least, yet it may also force the economy, as one expert eloquently put it, into the snare of perpetual war. Put in this context, Putin's decision to dig in and deadlock the struggle in a deadly stalemate over the past year makes full economic sense. Unless the Russian economy tanks, which admittedly it appears unlikely to do, Putin's popularity will remain intact. Yet we should all remember that we've seen this movie before. Unchecked military spending over imprecise amounts of time in economies over-reliant on singular industries sounds an awful lot like the Cold War. Living conditions will eventually deteriorate. Critical industries will increasingly struggle to source the maintenance and technological parts they need. Brain drain caused by the loss of hundreds of thousands of fleeing Russians, endemic migrant worker shortages caused by the fact that due to sanctions, workers are simply unable to send their wages back home. All this constitutes a deadly cycle. As Russia runs out of labor and thus becomes unable to supply its soldiers, it could result in potentially devastating political consequences. But what does Putin care? He has 47 million men of military age to draw from, compared to only 15 million in Ukraine. This critical 3-to-1 advantage will pay dividends in a war of attrition, especially because Putin knows Ukraine also needs a 3-to-1 advantage for their ongoing offensive operations to have a chance of penetrating his military defenses, and that number is generally only applicable when the aggressor enjoys some semblance of air power. It's now a waiting game. Winter will put a freeze on operational mobility for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, the sinews of Putin's power continue to hum along. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content and analysis from military experts. Let's say things with Russia turn into the worst-case scenario. A deranged, desperate Vladimir Putin sees his regime about to collapse. In a last-ditch effort to take as many enemies with him as possible, he orders a massive launch of Russia's nuclear arsenal, targeting the West. As the silos open, hundreds or thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads streak away at speeds of 15,000 miles per hour. But where are they headed? Thankfully, this hypothetical remains very, very unlikely. Unfortunately, it's also not entirely impossible. Russia has the world's largest nuclear stockpile, with nearly 6,000 weapons and roughly 1,600 actively deployed warheads. The question of where these might strike if fired is one that experts and policymakers have worried about since the days of the Cold War. Now, with nuclear threats once rising again, it's worth looking at how such a doomsday scenario might play out. In this video, we'll take a look at the places Russia might target with a nuclear barrage, starting in the United States. Some of the first US targets for a Russian nuclear strike are the major centers of power you would expect. The Pentagon is among the most important of these, as it acts as the headquarters for the US Department of Defense. If Russia were able to damage or destroy the Pentagon, it would be an enormous blow to the command structure of the US military. It would likely not cripple the US armed forces, but would cause a major disruption and make it far more difficult for the US to organize a response. Because of the size of the nuclear blast and its fallout, a strike on the Pentagon would also likely destroy much of Washington, D.C. Some 713,000 people live in D.C., while more than 6.3 million live in the greater D.C. area. Estimates for a nuclear strike on the Pentagon indicate that close to 500,000 people could be killed instantly, with many more falling sick from radioactive fallout afterwards. The initial blast would vaporize the Pentagon itself and anything else within a half-mile radius. Damage from the strike would radiate outwards some 4 miles from the epicenter, including the area containing the US Capitol building, White House, and Supreme Court. While the nuclear fireball and the enormous shockwave following it would be deadly on their own, it is the potential for widespread radiation which would create the biggest hazard. Radiation anywhere near the blast would be intense enough to cause third-degree burns, while also causing many harmful mutations in victims' DNA, leading to cellular degeneration and cancer. Even if people in the larger blast radius managed to survive the explosion, there's a good chance they would die from the huge amount of radiation exposure. The White House is roughly 2.17 miles from the Pentagon, putting it well within the damage zone of a nuclear blast. If the president were there, they would likely be killed by the force of the shockwave, even if the White House and Capitol were not targeted independently. Thousands of US officials and workers would certainly be killed, sending the government into crisis mode. The president would declare a state of emergency and likely invoke martial law. If the president were killed, the next in the line of succession would be the vice president, Speaker of the House of Representatives, President pro tempore of the Senate, Secretary of State, and so on until someone alive could be reached. Besides the institutions around Washington, D.C., the second major goal of a Russian nuclear attack would be to strike as many US missile silos as possible in order to minimize a retaliatory strike. There is almost no chance this would be totally effective, as the US has nearly as many nuclear weapons as Russia, in addition to advanced early warning systems, nuclear submarines hidden around the world, and powerful air defense systems. but Russia would certainly try to take out as many silos as possible, especially those bases with Minuteman III ICBMs, which would mean targeting some very remote parts of the US. One of these is Malmstrom Air Force Base, located deep in the state of Montana. There are around 3,400 military personnel and 1,000 civilians working at Malmstrom, many responsible for the 150 Minuteman III nuclear missiles housed at the base. If a Russian nuclear weapon were able to strike Malmstrom, it would likely kill everyone at the base, plus nearly 15,000 people in the nearby towns of Black Eagle and Great Falls. The number of injured would be nearly double, even though the area is very sparsely populated. But high casualties would not be the goal of a strike on Malmstrom, as Russia would only be trying to cripple the ability of ICBMs to be fired from the base. The effects of a nuclear strike on the local environment would be devastating. Water flowing through the Mississippi River near the impact site would instantly vaporize, while the flow from upstream would eventually pass through the irradiated area around Malmstrom. The river would carry radioactive particles downstream, potentially all the way down its length. It would take months or years for any water drawn from nearby sources to be drinkable. In the meantime, large amounts of animals could die of radiation poisoning, even those hundreds of miles away. The ecological effect of such a shock would be felt across the country, and Malmstrom is far from the only target in a potential nuclear attack by Russia. Another key base likely to be targeted by Russia is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. The base contains roughly another 150 Minuteman III missiles and a staff of 3,200 military personnel and 420 civilians. However, the town of Minot is also more populous, with nearly 50,000 people. There would likely be over 23,000 immediate casualties, with another 20,000 suffering from injuries and radiation sickness. Like Malmstrom, any strike on Minot AFB would also cause huge environmental damage, with radioactive fallout contaminating groundwater, soil, and air. The final ICBM silo which Russia would likely attempt to first strike on would be Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The ICBMs there would be a harder target since they are actually spread around in silos between Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. The base has roughly similar numbers of staff and missiles to Malmstrom and Minot, and casualties from a strike would exceed 25,000. Cheyenne, Wyoming would also be devastated, and anyone present would receive a high dose of radiation. In addition to the major silos, a Russian nuclear attack would also target command and control centers across the country. Many of these are similarly hidden in rural locations around the US, often in plain sight. One major target would be the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD headquarters at Peterson Air Base in Colorado. NORAD is a joint organization made up of US and Canadian service members and civilians, responsible for aerospace protection of North America. Unfortunately, Peterson Base has over 8,700 active duty personnel, 1,300 reservists, 1,900 civilian staff, 10,000 family members, and over 20,000 veterans. The base also sits just outside the city of Colorado Springs, which has a population of nearly 500,000. A nuclear strike in this area would probably kill more than 60,000 people outright, and injure or irradiate another 200,000. Contamination of the water, air, and soil would again render much of the area uninhabitable, while winds could carry it into Kansas and other neighboring states. Another major target is Offutt Air Force Base, just outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Offutt is the headquarters of the U.S. Strategic Command, or STRATCOM, responsible for strategic nuclear deterrence, global strike, and operating the Defense Department's global information grid. STRATCOM is critical to the operation of the larger US military. If a nuclear warhead struck Offutt Air Force Base, it could kill more than 40,000 and injure nearly 150,000. It would also seriously degrade the US ability to coordinate a military response and potentially create confusion within the command structure of the armed forces. Similarly, the nearby city of Omaha would be largely destroyed, potentially killing hundreds of thousands. The Missouri River would also be contaminated, leading to the deaths of wildlife and a drop in biodiversity. In the event that STRATCOM was hit with a nuclear strike, its command would be transferred to one of the other 10 command and control centers around the country. The new command would oversee preparations for a retaliatory nuclear strike, which could happen almost instantly, since Russia would be hard-pressed to cripple the US nuclear triad. Yet another potential target for Russian nukes would be the VLF, or Very Low Frequency Transmitter in Cutler, Maine. This station transmits one-way communications to submarines in the US Navy's Atlantic Fleet. allowing them to carry out strikes if necessary. Cutler transmits its messages at 24 kHz and only uses 1.8 megawatts of power, a relatively low data rate. It is Cutler base which sends launch codes to US Ohio-class nuclear submarines in the Atlantic, which form the most difficult leg of the nuclear triad for any enemy to deal with. By destroying Cutler, Russia could theoretically cut off US contact with the subs and make a retaliatory strike harder. While immediate loss of life from a strike on Cutler would be under 1,000, its position on the Atlantic coast means that ocean life and coastal ecosystems would take most of the damage. There is also Cutler's counterpart in Washington, the Jim Creek Naval Radio Station, which transmits to the Pacific Fleet. It also sits in a remote area with few potential casualties, but again, air and water contamination from radiation could reach both Seattle and Vancouver, potentially making life in both cities hazardous. The blast would also create huge forest fires in Washington, which could burn for weeks on end, creating even more hazardous air conditions. Russia would also target bases on Hawaii, which sits roughly 2,000 miles from the US mainland. On the island of Oahu is another VLF transmitter, which can relay orders to the Pacific Submarine Fleet if the Jim Creek installation is damaged or destroyed. The Lualua transmitter unfortunately also makes Hawaii a prime target, as it provides redundancy for fleet communications. A Russian ICBM strike on Oahu would also be extremely deadly, as it is the most populated Hawaiian island, with over 1 million people at any given time. Due to its isolation and contained ecology, a nuclear strike on Oahu could make almost the entire island uninhabitable. There are also very few places for people to hide from such an attack, so anyone on the island would either die quickly or be in serious trouble. Since Hawaii also plays host to multiple US naval bases such as Pearl Harbor, there is also a good chance that the state would be hit with multiple missiles, leaving no places for easy evacuation. Every one of these is a strategic military installation, but even just nuclear strikes on these positions would kill many hundreds of thousands of Americans. The effect of a nuclear attack on multiple US cities would be far, far deadlier. If Putin truly opted for nuclear war, there is no reason to think he would do it halfway, and hitting the US's major cities would also destroy their economic capacity. In a first-strike nuclear scenario, each side would try to devastate the other beyond recovery, and that means the widespread targeting of civilians. Such an attack could easily be the deadliest in human history, far exceeding the only past uses of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Outside of Washington, D.C., New York is the most obvious civilian target. It is both the financial capital of the United States and its largest city, as well as a global symbol of American power. It goes without saying that a nuclear explosion in Manhattan would be beyond devastating. The island is only 13.4 miles long, but it is one of the most densely populated areas in the entire country. An 800 kiloton nuclear warhead would instantly kill between 1.5 and 2 million people, with another 3 to 5 million seriously injured from radiation, burns, or collapsed buildings. The 5 boroughs of New York City collectively have almost 8.5 million, and every single one would have their lives upended. Even for those who avoid the initial blast or fireball, the shockwave's 500 mph winds could prove fatal. As researchers recently wrote in New York Magazine, it would demolish the flimsiest buildings and strip the walls and roofs off stronger structures, leaving only their naked and warped scaffolding. It would snap utility poles like toothpicks and rip through trees, fling people through the air, and turn brick, glass, wood, and metal into deadly projectiles. A blast in Times Square, combined with the fireball, would carve a crater 50 feet deep at the center of the explosion. The shockwave would reach a diameter of nearly 3.2 miles, shattering windows as far as Gramercy Park and the American Museum of Natural History. The city's medical infrastructure would strain or collapse under the burden, especially with many major hospitals destroyed. Similarly, evacuation from Manhattan and other boroughs would be extremely difficult due to the destroyed buildings, collapsed tunnels and bridges, and press of people trying to escape. Nuclear blasts also release a strong electromagnetic pulse, which would knock out vital systems across the city, including electronic communication, medical technology, and the power grid itself. This would make any emergency response vastly more difficult and lead to even greater casualties. Yet in the event of a real nuclear war, Russia wouldn't stop there. Los Angeles is another obvious target. As the country's second-largest city and a major source of American wealth and cultural power, LA is not as densely populated as New York City, with some 4 million inhabitants and sprawling, low-rise housing. But at this point, we probably don't need to tell you that a nuclear blast in downtown LA would also be apocalyptic. 500,000 to 700,000 could die instantly, with 1.5 million more injured. LA also has roughly 5.5 million cars and little public transportation. Because of this, major roads even well outside the blast zone would be almost impossible to use, as people flee from the radioactive fallout. LA's chronic drought would also be made far worse, potentially leaving millions without safe drinking water. In the middle of the country, Chicago and its nearly 3 million residents would also likely be targeted. A nuclear blast here could kill 500,000 to 600,000 instantly and badly injure over 1 million, while a large portion of the blast would explode into Lake Michigan, with winds spreading the fallout north, south, and east. The heavy populated Great Lakes region would be at risk and probably need to be evacuated as well. To have any chance in a nuclear war, Putin would need to go all out before the West could overwhelm Russia's limited defenses. Because of the effects of wind, even a small percentage of the nuclear weapons in Russia's arsenal could spread fallout across much of the United States and make many areas completely uninhabitable. Being far away from the actual impact sites still might not be a guarantee of safety, especially in more densely populated parts of the country. Since 80% of Americans live east of the Mississippi River, any nuclear strike on the eastern seaboard would be especially deadly. Overall, estimates suggest that the total number killed, injured, or exposed to radiation in a full Russian nuclear attack could exceed 256 million. That's 3/4 of the population just in the United States. But an attack on the US would also leave Russia open to retaliation from other NATO countries, meaning that they too would almost certainly be targeted early in a nuclear conflict. This would mean major European military installations like Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, which coordinates NATO's air and missile defense networks. Spotters at Ramstein would be among the first to know if a country like Russia actually launched nuclear ICBMs, but due to its relative geographic proximity, there will be little time for a possible evacuation. A nuclear blast over Ramstein would kill some 30,000 people, while winds could potentially carry fallout across the continent. Assuming a retaliatory strike didn't just wipe Moscow off the map, this also makes European targets riskier for Putin in the event of a nuclear attack, since at least some fallout could make it all the way back to the Kremlin. Other military targets in Europe which might be targeted include NATO's Supreme Allied Command in Belgium, as well as other US bases in Europe, like Caserma Ederle in Italy, which hosts the US's powerful 173rd Airborne Brigade. Strategically or economically important cities in Europe are also potential targets. This includes London, the most populous city in Western Europe, with over 8.8 million people. The UK also has roughly 200 nuclear weapons of its own, which also might make it a high-risk target. Similarly to New York City, a nuclear explosion over London could instantly kill over 1 million, while total casualties from the shockwave and radiation could be over 2.3 million. London is also the capital of the UK, meaning that its government would also likely perish in the blast. As with other cities, London's vital infrastructure would also be completely devastated, making any emergency response very difficult. And coastal winds coming off the Atlantic could carry the radiation north into Scotland, and west into France and other parts of continental Europe. Long story short, anywhere in the world getting hit with a modern nuclear weapon would be a horrifying scenario. While this hypothetical is obviously incredibly unlikely to happen, it's also pretty obvious that if it did, there would be basically no good options. Because of the concept of mutually assured destruction, which has kept nuclear war at bay since the 1950s, governments like the US are ridiculously unprepared to deal with the consequences if it did happen. As the article in New York Magazine recently put it, more than 70 years ago, America became the first and only country to use nuclear weapons in war. Despite witnessing the immediate and enduring horror of those attacks, despite decades of technological advances in nuclear warfare, the US remains shockingly unprepared for a similar assault on its own soil. Much of the short-term response to a nuclear explosion in a city like New York would be improvised, adapted from plans meant for other kinds of disasters. Putin knows that firing even a single nuclear weapon would likely mean the end of him and possibly much of Russia. But the fact remains that nukes are out there and could theoretically be used at any time in the future. In an increasingly uncertain world, it wouldn't hurt governments around the world to step up their nuclear preparations, because the fact is, it's impossible to know the future. But what do you think? What would the targets for a Russian nuclear attack be? And just how unprepared is the world for that small possibility? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. This is Poland. Once the tragic crossroad of European empires, it has undergone nothing short of a Western military renaissance in the 21st century and is now becoming one of the most feared armies in Europe. Yep, you heard that right. Poland has become a military beast, and Putin really should think twice before deciding to poke this fully staffed, well-armed, and exceptionally trained bear. The ongoing war in Ukraine has undeniably influenced Poland's military posture. But with the flurry of spending increases, arms deals, and recruitment programs, what exactly is Poland gearing up for, and will it be prepared? After what Poland's been through in recent history, trying to pull off a modern military revival is no joke. Within the span of a single lifetime, the Polish nation waded through shattering, simultaneous military defeats at the hands of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, a wartime occupation, partitioning, and tragic Holocaust, and its complete absorption into the Warsaw Pact as a Soviet satellite for the 40 years that followed. Talk about trauma. During the latter Cold War period, Poland's population doubled. It maintained a decently large standing army, often joined by Soviet troops stationed within its territory. The Eastern Bloc country, led by unapologetic communist officials closely aligned with Stalin's regime, nevertheless managed to rebuild its devastated cities in the aftermath of World War II, slowly raising the standard of living among its inhabitants. Over time, hardline Stalinists fell from power, followed closely by many ousted Soviet officers who had for decades filled leadership positions throughout the Polish army. The 1970s and 80s ushered in an era of turbulent protests and political change. The rise of Solidarity, a widely popular anti-communist social movement, preceded mass pushback to, and the eventual breakdown of, Soviet authority in Poland. The Poles wanted freedom, and eventually took it. By 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union created the conditions for democratic elections, Poland's first since 1920. This landmark moment was to be Poland's first major step in its inexorable civil-military transformation, one that would see the nation progressively look westward for models upon which it could base its rapidly developing economic, military, and political systems. Poland's Western integration scared the pants off enemy soldiers, and on September 18, 1993, Soviet troops left the country for good. Just 5 years later, in 1999, Poland officially joined NATO. 5 years after that, it joined the EU. But Poland trying to become besties with the West is not a new story. Today, many people forget that though Poland was ravaged by the Axis early on in World War II, its armies in exile fled Soviet gulags and went on to fight gallantly as pilots, sailors, and soldiers within the Allied armies abroad. With hundreds of thousands of Poles voluntarily serving in Italy and on the Eastern Front, they fought with hope that they might someday rebuild Poland from the ashes. A new Poland, one free from the tyranny of coercive foreign regimes. Poland followed this North Star as it cast away the vestiges of Soviet control in the new millennium. Ever since, it has progressively sought to become a self-sufficient, independent power in its own right. Even before it joined the EU, Poland sent 2,000 soldiers to participate in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, then the coalition's fourth largest military contribution behind the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Poland maintained its presence in Iraq for years, participating in and even leading Multinational Division Central South, a NATO unit responsible for an entire occupation zone as part of Multinational Force Iraq. Their deployment lasted until 2008, when Polish troops were finally withdrawn from the country, but Iraq was just the beginning. In Afghanistan too, Poland signaled its solidarity with the West. There for the duration of the 20-year forever war, the Poles proved themselves reliable, trustworthy partners, cycling through more than 33,000 personnel in what constituted the largest peacekeeping mission in Poland's military history. We're telling you, you want these guys to be on your side. But don't take our word for it. Western veterans of these two wars whose tours of duty brought them into contact with their Polish allies almost unanimously praised their martial prowess, professionalism, and battlefield capabilities. Each additional year spent as part of NATO's multinational deployments increased Poland's military effectiveness, interoperability, and trustworthiness. With certain pundits labeling Poland an emergent protégé of the United States in Central and Eastern Europe, the nation has more than demonstrated its unity with other NATO allies, as well as its approval and support of American security policies. Since 1989, each successive Polish government has supported America's forward military presence in Europe, seeing in their ally a source of protection, friendship, and economic prosperity it so desperately lacked throughout its fraught history. Poland has repeatedly been one of few NATO countries willing to fulfill their obligations to spend 2% of their GDP on defense spending, a point of friction between the US and its other NATO allies in recent years. With amicable relations deteriorating between Poland's current right-wing government and President Joe Biden, who won the presidency in 2020, Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused a resurgence in Polish-American relations. Ever since, the two countries have reaffirmed their commitment to each other and to their shared desire to arm Ukraine with the weapons it needs to succeed. Great, everyone's getting along. Now let's get down to business and talk about geostrategy and tanks. The latest landmark decision to finally send main battle tanks to Ukraine has renewed attention on the United States and Germany. In reality, Ukraine owes much of the decision's outcome to Poland, who was one of the first countries to pressure a reticent Berlin into increasing its support for Ukraine by asking for approval to transfer its own German-made Leopard 2 tanks. Talk about heart. Jeopardizing its own diplomatic relationship with its German neighbor, Poland acted as a catalyst for consensus, eventually deciding to send its Leopards to Ukraine even without explicit German consent. Arguably, this choice helped bring Berlin and the rest of the West into agreement on the issue. It also demonstrated Poland's proactive leadership role as a vocal opponent of Russian aggression, warnings it has been issuing to Europe since it joined the European Union in 2004. Today, Poland is the security linchpin on the NATO alliance's eastern flank. Strategically placed on Russia's westernmost border, its rapid economic modernization and expansion of its armed forces has catapulted it into 20th place in the list of the world's most powerful militaries. During the war in Ukraine, it has accepted more displaced Ukrainian refugees than any other European nation, several million in fact, providing them access to healthcare, education, and employment in the process. Poland also ranks highly in European military aid to Ukraine, surpassing virtually every European nation save their neighbors in the Baltics. To date, they have sent hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, and small arms to their imperiled neighbor, likewise opening their roadways to an unending stream of international aid flowing into Ukraine in great numbers. What about the rest of the West? Let's just say Europe's old guard have not emerged from the conflict in Ukraine unscathed. Great Britain is no longer a part of the European Union. Germany's initial reluctance to distance itself from Russian trade deals, pipelines, and natural resources, and the French president's dogged belief in the possibility of a negotiated settlement with Putin despite Ukraine's wishes to restore its original borders have seen each country's prestige fall. Poland has wholeheartedly jumped into this leadership vacuum and is now attempting to warn the wider world about the danger posed by Putin's Russia. In a September 2022 speech, the Polish President Andrzej Duda warned the United States General Assembly that this is not just a regional conflict. Russia's war against Ukraine is a potential source of global conflagration. This war will affect our countries as well as yours if it hasn't already. This, then, is what Poland is truly afraid of. For decades during the Cold War, it nervously awaited a war between the Soviet bloc and the West, knowing its borders might once again become Europe's bloodlands. Today, the threat remains. Eastern Europe is experiencing its worst conflict since World War II, and from the start, global leaders have warned against any actions that could escalate into a potential World War III scenario. Last November, this was almost what happened. That month, an errant missile crossed over into Polish territory, detonating at an agricultural grain-weighing facility, killing 2 people. The event, the war's first strike on territory outside Ukraine, prompted a barrage of coverage. Who fired the missile? From where? Why? Everyone knew NATO's famous Article 5 defense clause in the alliance's founding charter meant an attack on one ally was an attack on them all. Prudently, as the world leaders waited for answers, world leaders, none more patient than Poland, collected and weighed the evidence, ultimately deciding the event was likely a misfire, and ultimately not enough to invoke Article 5. It may not have sparked World War III, but the strike did prompt Polish officials to redouble their efforts to prepare for such an eventuality. Several months before, an opinion poll found that 84% of Poles expressed fears that military action could spill over into Polish territory. Poland, much like Ukraine, knows it could never face Russia alone without the material and moral support from the West. Could it? It would be impossible to predict how a conflict between Poland and Russia might unfold, nor how much support Poland might receive from NATO and the West. One thing's for sure, Poland isn't waiting around to find out. In the meantime, it's doing its utmost to deter Russia by arming and equipping its armed forces in a way that gives them the highest probability of military success. Is it overreacting? We really don't think so. In many respects, Poland now sees Ukraine fulfilling the role it was once destined to fill, the linchpin of European security, the first wall of defense against a Russian bear railing in its unrelenting quest to fulfill its imperialist ambitions. Poland has claimed it will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. The nation's historic antipathy to all things Russian and Russia's blatant disregard for its neighbors' sovereignty has prompted a thorough rededication to its own defense through an impressive military buildup. Poland already arguably possesses Europe's best army, but after the November 2022 missile incident, it looks set to get even stronger. And it means business. Since the start of Russia's invasion, Poland claims it has experienced its highest wave of recruitment since it officially ended conscription back in 2008. In 2022, it recruited more than 13,500 professional soldiers, about 8% of Poland's total armed forces of 164,000. With the recent announcement to astronomically increase its military spending from 2.5 to 4, possibly even 5% of its GDP, it aims to increase its overall force structure to 300,000 professional soldiers. This will not only dwarf Germany's 1.5% of GDP spent on defense, it will see Poland almost double its army of 170,000. It is the type of commitment that shows Poland has already become, in the words of a senior US Army official in Europe, our most important partner in continental Europe. Wait, it gets better. The Polish military renaissance means an even tighter defense alliance with the United States, one of its main weapon suppliers. In 2020, the Polish government reached agreements to purchase HIMARS rocket launchers, F-35 combat aircraft, Patriot air defense systems, MRAPs, and hundreds of M1 Abrams tanks to replace its stockpile of the 240 Soviet tanks it sent to Ukraine. It has announced its intention to eventually incorporate American Black Hawk helicopters made in Poland by Lockheed Martin, other multi-role aircraft, and drones to complement its arsenal of American F-16s already in use among its air forces. This is not all. Poland is also ordering billions of dollars worth of weapons from cheaper South Korean weapons manufacturers, with a $10 to $12 billion order for 180 K2 Black Panther tanks, 200 K9 Thunder howitzers, 48 Fa-50 light attack aircraft, and 218 K2-39 Chunmoo rocket launchers. And that's only the used gear. Poland's appetite for new arms is even bigger, claimed one journalist. Korea will eventually send Poland 1,000 K2 tanks and 600 K9 howitzers in the coming years. It has also purchased Italian Leonardo attack helicopters to be built in Poland. Talk about being prepared for anything. What could go wrong? Well, some do say Poland's unprecedented defense spending will strain its domestic budget to the breaking point, but its neighbors are hardly complaining. They know the more Poland spends, the safer they'll be. Poland is acting on its stated desire to become Central Europe's preeminent military power. Many doubt whether their vision will ever come to fruition. Polish military stocks are still heavily based on Soviet-era surplus after all, but the recent influx of American weapons like the M1A2 Abrams into the country, its diversification to the other foreign weapon markets, and its emphasis on recruiting and training a new generation of dedicated soldiers certainly paint a promising picture that it might. And in the eventuality that Russian aggression spills beyond Ukraine's borders, Europe can be assured that if any country will be ready to fight, Poland will be chief among them. But what do you think? Will Poland eventually find itself in an epic battle with Putin's army? If so, are they ready? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.